Deep within the heart of the dense forest, I sought refuge from the relentless chaos of city life that had worn me thin. The sun's descent beneath the horizon was a mesmerizing spectacle, casting whimsical, dancing shadows among the tall, ancient trees. As darkness stealthily advanced, its cool fingers brushed against the woods, sending a palpable chill that seemed to creep down my spine like the tendrils of an unseen specter. Around me, the campfire crackled in a soothing rhythm, its mesmerizing dance offering not only warmth, but also a reassuring companionship in the solitude. I found myself perched on a weathered log, my gaze locked onto the flickering flames as they flickered and danced like wraiths lost in an otherworldly ballet. Amidst the soothing crackling, a faint rustling sound brushed against my ears, a mere whisper in the night. I brushed it off, attributing it to the playful activities of a nocturnal creature. Yet a persistent undercurrent of unease began to gnaw at the edges of my thoughts. Minutes flowed seamlessly into hours as I sat cocooned within my thoughts, immersing myself in the calming embrace of nature. I contemplated the serenity of my surroundings, the gentle sway of the trees, and the tranquil symphony of crickets and distant owls. Yet, as time wandered on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest held its breath, as if a vigilant sentinel stood watch over my solitude. With the encroaching night, I determined it was time to retreat into the sanctuary of my tent. The cool night air held promises of restful slumber, an opportunity to be embraced. Within the cozy confines of my sleeping bag, I carefully zipped the tent shut, sealing myself within its fabric walls. I laid there, still and hopeful, as the night's embrace settled around me. But the tranquility of the forest was shattered by a sound that tore through the night air, a guttural growl that reverberated like an unsettling echo. My heart catapulted into a frenzy of rapid beats pounding like a distant drum, for the sound was all too familiar. The ominous growl of a black panther, a creature renowned for its deadly prowess. Paralyzed by fear, I found myself inhaling shallow, ragged breaths. The once comforting rustle of leaves and the gentle snap of twigs became ominous warnings, each sound sending tremors down my spine. Beyond the thin fabric of the tent, the world felt dense and heavy, an inky void concealing the presence of the panther, a creature that stalked my camp with an eerie sense of purpose. Fear took root, sending tendrils of imagination sprawling. My mind conjured images of gleaming, predatory eyes glinting in the darkness, and sleek, powerful muscles poised to strike with deadly precision. My flashlight, clutched in my clammy hand, felt like a meager lifeline against the vast, unknown void that enveloped me. As hours unfolded like slow-motion waves, I found myself trapped in a relentless cycle of fatigue and fear. Just as my eyelids threatened to surrender to exhaustion, a bone-chilling roar cleaved through the night's silence like a blade. Adrenaline surged through my veins, a surge of energy that intensified my grip on the flashlight. In that moment, the beam of light became my talisman, a source of strength that flickered defiantly against the consuming darkness. The promise of dawn beckoned on the horizon, a distant glimmer of hope against the omnipresent terror. The panther's menacing aura persisted, an obstinate stalker unswayed by my silent pleas for its departure. With each passing moment, the forest began to stir. There was the hopeful, melodious chorus of birdsong, the gentle rustling of leaves as nature itself seemed to exhale in the face of a new day. As the first rays of light pierced the darkness, the forest underwent a metamorphosis. The shadows that had danced so eerily now retreated, unveiling a realm of verdant serenity. Tentatively, I emerged from my tent, shivers coursing down my spine as I bore witness to the tranquil morning that had remained concealed throughout the long, harrowing night. The memory of that night, of symphonic roars and lurking dread, etched itself indelibly into my mind. The primal fear, the raw vulnerability, and the unwavering determination to survive all melded into a profound experience that left an indelible mark. As I stood amidst the grandeur of nature's theater, my understanding expanded, my perspective shifted by the raw ferocity that lay beneath the veneer of serenity. I was driving home on a quiet, moonlit night, the road stretching ahead like a ribbon through the darkness. The hum of the engine and the soft music playing on the radio were my only companions. The feeling of solitude was both peaceful and eerie, like being in my own little bubble within the world. As I turned onto a deserted stretch of road, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Glancing in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. There, illuminated by my headlights, was a car following closely behind me. My stomach twisted into knots, and I told myself it was just a coincidence, someone else traveling the same way. But as I continued on, so did the car behind me, maintaining a constant distance. Unease settled in, and I decided to test my theory by making a sudden turn onto a side road. To my horror, the other car followed suit, its headlights now casting an eerie glow on my rear bumper. My mind raced, and I began to consider my options. I couldn't go home. I couldn't let this stranger know where I lived. Panic started to grip me, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I had to shake this pursuer off my tail. I made a series of random turns, trying to lose the car behind me, but it stuck like glue. The roads became narrower, and the surroundings grew increasingly unfamiliar. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a stark reminder of the danger I was in. I couldn't call the police. I didn't even know what to tell them. So I kept driving, desperation gnawing at my mind. Suddenly, a flicker of hope ignited within me as I spotted a gas station up ahead. Maybe I could pull in and find help. As I neared the station, I stole a quick glance in my mirror. The other car was still there, as if this were some kind of sick game. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled into the gas station and practically leaped out of my car, my legs shaky and weak. My eyes darted around, searching for a store or someone, anyone who could help me. But the station was eerily deserted, the only sound being the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared from behind the gas pumps. My heart leapt at the sight of another person, relief washing over me like a tidal wave. It was a middle-aged man, dressed in worn clothing. I rushed up to him, stumbling over my words as I explained the situation. He listened calmly, his expression unreadable. After a tense moment, he finally spoke, his voice low and grave. He told me that I had unknowingly stumbled into a dangerous game that people in the area whispered about in hushed tones. The game was simple. Someone would be chosen to be followed, and the pursuer would never let them escape. If the person being followed managed to evade their pursuer until dawn, they would win a substantial amount of money. I felt a mix of disbelief and terror. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but the car behind me was all too real. The man offered to help me, saying he knew the lay of the land better than anyone. He suggested we team up to lose my pursuer. With no other options, I agreed. He hopped into his old pickup truck, and we sped off into the night, taking sharp turns and winding through back roads. The tension was palpable, every second feeling like an eternity. I glanced at the clock. It was nearing dawn, and the pursuit showed no sign of letting up. Just as despair was about to consume me, the sun's first rays began to streak across the sky. We had made it. The car following me eventually gave up the chase, disappearing into the early morning mist. As the man and I caught our breath, he explained that the people behind this game were deeply entrenched in the shadows, and involving the police would only put us in greater danger. He advised me to leave town and keep quiet about the incident, to erase any trace of my involvement. I took his advice to heart. I packed up my belongings, said goodbye to my home, and left the town behind. The memory of that harrowing night still haunts me, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of the ordinary. So, whenever I'm driving alone at night, a shiver runs down my spine. I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. A chilling reminder that some nightmares are all too real. As a nurse working the late shift, exhaustion gnawed at me. The sterile scent of the surgical ward, a place I had grown accustomed to, was now overwhelming. It had been a relentless night, and all I craved was the solace of my own bed. I had just finished my final rounds, ensuring every patient was stable and comfortable before heading to the catwalk above the surgical theater. My footsteps echoed through the dimly lit passage as I trudged toward the exit, my heart yearning for the respite of rest. But when I reached the door, the handle refused to turn. Panic surged through me as I tugged frantically, realizing with growing dread that I was locked in. I fumbled for my phone, trembling fingers desperately trying to dial for help, only to discover that there was no signal in this metal cocoon. A chill swept over me as I gazed down at the silent surgical theater below. The operating lights cast eerie, elongated shadows on the lifeless equipment. Fear clawed at my chest as I pounded on the door, screamed until my throat grew raw, but the sounds disappeared into the vast emptiness. Hours crawled by, and desperation gave way to hysteria. Why was no one coming to my rescue? I pounded on the floor, hoping someone would hear, but the sterile walls absorbed my cries. The catwalk, usually a place of mere passage, became my prison. As the night dragged on, my mind played tricks on me. I saw fleeting figures in the shadows, heard phantom whispers in the echoing silence. Was this isolation driving me mad? Or was something malevolent lurking in this lifeless place? Tears streaked my cheeks as I huddled in a corner, haunted by the possibility that I might never escape. The once familiar surgical ward transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth of despair. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the door swung open. The lights from the corridor spilled into the catwalk, blinding me momentarily. I was free. The nurses and doctors who had discovered me babbled words of concern and comfort, their faces etched with worry. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words tumbled out incoherently. They exchanged glances, their expressions a strange mixture of sympathy and doubt. None of them seemed to understand how I could have been locked in, how I had been isolated from their world. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those long, terrifying hours on the catwalk. I know it was real, even if they choose not to believe me. And when I walk past that surgical theater, I can't help but feel a lingering presence, a malevolent force that watches and waits in the shadows, ready to claim another unfortunate soul. I'm sharing this bone-chilling tale on Reddit as a cautionary warning to those fascinated by the supernatural. My nighttime visit to an abandoned graveyard unearthed secrets and spirits best left undisturbed. It started as a dare among friends one Halloween night after too much candy and not enough parental supervision. We were young teens, overwhelmed with bravado, eager to prove our daring. Sneaking into the fenced-off old cemetery seemed the perfect rite of courage. We squeezed through a gap in the rusted wrought iron fence, scurrying amid tilting tombstones like mice through a stone maze. Nervous laughter echoed through the neglected burial ground as we scanned for ghosts. But the night remained still, no spirits rushing forth to admonish our trespassing. Emboldened, we split up to explore, shoving each other and boasting of our boldness. In the beam of my flashlight, the moss-covered monuments seemed harmless enough, if decrepit from decades of neglect. This was nothing compared to the haunted houses and gory movies that thrilled us. But as I ventured toward the older plots, a subtle shift occurred. The wind picked up, stirring dead leaves across the buckled pavement with a sound like scuttling claws. The bare tree branches cast grasping shadows in the cold moonlight. Carved angels gazed down with stern disapproval. The crooked rows of weathered headstones seemed to close in around me. Dates from the centuries past reflected lives lost to time. Tiny graves marked children dead in infancy. The dusty urns and stone flowers hinted at grief distilled into cold, hard memorials. Amid those time-worn memorials, the boasts of my friends sounded childish rather than courageous. Surrounded by the legions of the dead, our brazen mockery seemed vulgar. We were interlopers in a realm not meant for foolhardy boys. I opened my mouth to call the others back, only to be halted by an unearthly sound. A soft whisper drifted through the tombstones, barely audible, yet chilling my bones. It spoke no distinct words, yet conveyed a deep and inconsolable sorrow. I froze, flashbeam gripped tight, unsure if the others were playing some trick. but no human vocal cords could produce such a haunting, ethereal sigh. It echoed from all around me, as if the very ground was exhaling the grief of those buried within it. Goosebumps prickled my arms as the eerie lament continued. Some instinct told me to flee back to the safety of the streetlights, but morbid curiosity drew me toward the source, an imposing stone mausoleum with an iron gate. I crept up the crumbling steps to the entrance, where the spectral whispers grew louder, interwoven with soft weeping. Peering through the bars, my light revealed a pale figure within, a young woman in tattered Victorian dress, her face obscured by long dark tresses. She slowly raised her head, eyes gleaming like cold stars in the shadows. Her voice, clearer now, pleaded for company to ease her loneliness. I staggered back, nearly tumbling from the stairs. The hairs on my neck bristled as she grasped the gate with one skeletal hand. Icy fingers seemed to trace down my spine as she called me to join her. The night air vibrated with voices, no longer one, but many wraiths stirring from their slumber. I turned and fled blindly, no thought of finding my friends, only escape. The spectral chorus pursued me, voices rising in anguish, desperate not to be abandoned again. I scrambled over toppled tombstones and fallen angels, stumbling amid the graves. A root snared my foot and I went sprawling, flashlight flying from my grip. I lay frozen on the cold ground, enveloped in darkness as the whispers converged upon me. They pleaded, they cursed, they bargained for my companionship. Shadowy forms fluttered at the edge of my vision. Pure panic drove me upward again, heedless of my skinned knees and throbbing ankle. I ran like never before, banshee wails echoing after me until I squeezed out the iron fence. I collapsed on the sidewalk, dizzy with relief under the streetlight's sane glow. In the weeks that followed, I told no one of my experience, fearing ridicule and psychiatrists. I avoided the graveyard even in daylight, when it appeared mundane again. But those spirits' mournful cries still haunted my dreams. Years later in college, I found the courage to research that old cemetery and its history. Buried in library archives were tales of tragedy that illuminated my supernatural encounter. Many spirits lingered there who had passed violently or in deep despair. The woman in the mausoleum was one Ella Blackwood, buried in 1862 after pining away from heartbreak. Her lover left to make his fortune out west, never to return. Wasting away, Ella was interred while still clinging to life, it was said. Her anguished spirit remained trapped between realms, seeking solace from strangers. Other unfortunate souls populated the old burial ground. Convicts hanged from an oak on the grounds. The broken-hearted spurned by families. The poor and unknown buried in unmarked pits. All had passed in sorrow, left to fade from memory. Until, perhaps, some reckless visitor might stir them from their melancholic slumber. I now understood the great gift and privilege it is to still draw breath under the sun. Those spirits had so much left undone, cut short by misfortune. In their isolation, they envied the living and reached out desperately for companionship. But the veil between realms is best left undisturbed. I share my cautionary tale so you might avoid repeating my youthful recklessness. Graveyards may appear quaint places for daytime strolls, but at night, they awaken with spirits who still cling to their grief, rage, and unfulfilled dreams. We must not add to their sorrow by trespassing where the dead keep their own company. Let them rest undisturbed beneath aged monuments, kept from fading by carved names and occasional offerings. Bear them no ill will, but do not intrude upon their domain. We all will join their silent congregation soon enough. But while we yet live, it is our duty to squeeze every drop of joy and passion from these fleeting days in the sun. Cherish your beating heart and the breath in your lungs. Savor your senses that let you feel summer breeze, taste cold water, admire a sunrise. Do not take one moment for granted, for it could be your last. Listen to music, laugh with friends, whisper words of love and kindness. These simple acts are momentous for those stripped of everything but regret. As for the spirits who stir when we wander where we ought not to go, forgive them their envy and their appeals. In their own way, they only reach out for the warmth we still possess. They cannot help but crave our light, for they dwell in an eternity of cold darkness. But we must guard that precious light within us during our short time here. Do not surrender even a sliver of it to those who have none left. When our turn comes to join their silent world, we will understand the value of each fleeting breath, each ray of sunlight we took for granted. Until then, let us scatter more joy than sorrow as we pass through, leaving memories that glow bright long after we're gone. In this way, we too may gentle the grief of those we leave behind. When you visit graveyards, do so to honor the dead, not to disturb their peace. Bring blossoms, speak their names, share their tales, and remember well that your day too shall come. Death makes equals of us all in the end. But first, we must live with hearts open to all the beauty this realm yet has to offer. That is how we make our lives worthy of remembrance. So I beg you, seize your precious moments in this world and savor them fully. Keep to the light, honor the past, but do not seek forbidden knowledge not meant for the living. Leave the unhappy dead to fade on their own, and nurture your own spirit's flame so it burns bright long after your body rests beneath the earth. That is the lesson the graveyard taught me. Cherish this wisdom and value your life. The heart of Yellowstone National Park beckoned me on that moonless night, its mystique and allure impossible to resist. Eagerly, I ventured into the depths of the eerie forest, feeling a mixture of trepidation and excitement. The wind rustled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony of ghostly whispers that seemed to surround me, while the darkness seemed to swallow the world whole. Each step I took was like an involuntary dance, as if an unseen force guided my movements. It was as though the forest itself had a plan for me, leading me deeper into its enigmatic embrace. The rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig were the only sounds that punctuated the haunting stillness. A faint, flickering light danced tantalizingly in the distance, like a distant star inviting me to explore its secrets. My heart raced, torn between an instinctual desire to turn back and an irresistible curiosity pulling me forward. With each step, the light grew brighter, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. The light led me through a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled undergrowth, until I finally stumbled upon it, an old, dilapidated cabin hidden away in the heart of the woods. As if in a trance, I approached the cabin, my breath hitching as the air around me grew icy, sending shivers down my spine. It was as though the very atmosphere held a palpable tension, a weighty anticipation of what lay ahead. The cabin's door stood slightly ajar, creaking eerily in the wind. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and anticipation coursing through my veins. An inexplicable force drew me towards the entrance, as if an invisible hand were gently guiding me inside. The creaking door yielded with an eerie groan, revealing the dimly lit interior, and there she stood, a woman. Her figure ethereal and translucent, with hauntingly hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the depths of my soul. Her voice, soft and mournful, echoed in my mind, recounting a tale of love betrayed and a life cut short by tragedy. I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze away as her words etched themselves into the very core of my being. As her story unfolded, I could feel the weight of her sorrow settling over me, wrapping its tendrils around my heart. It was as if I was living her pain, her anguish, and her unfulfilled longing. Time seemed to stand still as I became a captive audience to her tale, lost in a world that straddled the realms of the living and the departed. Her hand reached out, fingers like tendrils of ice that brushed against my cheek. A surge of panic and desperation jolted me out of my reverie, and with an adrenaline-fueled burst of energy, I tore myself away from her grip. The cabin seemed to groan in protest as I stumbled out into the night, the darkness of the forest enveloping me once again. The very woods seemed to close in around me, trees leaning in like gnarled fingers eager to ensnare me in their clutches. Whispers and faint laughter echoed in the distance, chilling me to the bone. It was as though a legion of unseen spirits reveled in my fear, their presence palpable and unsettling. I tripped and fell, the forest floor unforgiving as I struggled to regain my footing. Leaves and dirt clung to my clothes, and a sense of disorientation clouded my thoughts. When I looked up, a mixture of dread and disbelief washed over me. I had returned to the cabin, its decaying frame standing as a sentinel of the supernatural. And there she was again, the ghostly woman, her figure framed by the cabin's threshold. Her gaze, fixed upon me, seemed to hold a depth of sorrow that transcended time itself. Panic surged through me anew, and with a determination born of sheer survival instinct, I turned and fled deeper into the woods, as if the very fabric of reality had bent to accommodate my desperate escape. Time became an elusive concept as I pushed myself through the unforgiving terrain, the darkness, a constant companion that seemed to both shield and threaten me. Hours might have passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time seemed to warp and bend, adhering to the rules of the forest rather than the world I knew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of stumbling and scrambling, I broke through the dense undergrowth and stumbled upon a ranger station, a beacon of safety amidst the haunting unknown. Gasping for breath, I stumbled inside, desperation in my eyes as I recounted my harrowing encounter to the ranger on duty. As my words spilled forth, the ranger's expression morphed from curiosity to a bone-chilling realization. He confirmed what I had feared. Decades ago, a woman named Eleanor had lived in that very cabin. Her life had been one of betrayal and heartache, and she had met a tragic end, left to perish alone in the depths of the unforgiving forest. Locals spoke of her spirit, a vengeful force that lured unsuspecting souls into her web of sorrow. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Had I not managed to break free from her grasp, I might have met the same fate as those who had come before me. The memory of that fateful night in Yellowstone's haunted woods still sends shivers down my spine. The ghostly whispers continue to echo in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the realm of the departed. Even now, I can feel the phantom touch of her icy fingers, a cold chill that refuses to be forgotten. The forest, with its mysteries and secrets, serves as a haunting reminder that some encounters defy rational explanation, leaving us to grapple with the unknown. The night was as dark as pitch, and the rain fell incessantly, creating an ominous symphony of chaos against the windshield of our speeding ambulance. We raced through the winding, rain-soaked roads, sirens wailing, blue and red lights piercing the relentless downpour. Our small-town emergency room had witnessed its share of accidents, but none of us could have foreseen the harrowing ordeal that awaited us. The call had come with an urgency that sent shivers down our spines. A car pileup on a remote, desolate road. Multiple casualties reported. As we arrived at the scene, the tableau that greeted us was one of sheer pandemonium. Mangled vehicles, their metal frames grotesquely contorted, lay scattered across the slick, rain-soaked asphalt. Injured and disoriented individuals, some hopelessly trapped inside the wreckage, cried out for help amidst the deafening deluge. It was a nightmarish sight that felt plucked from the pages of a horror story. Without hesitation, our emergency room staff sprang into action, their adrenaline-fueled hearts pounding as they surged towards the wreckage. Stretchers were hastily positioned, and gloved hands worked with surgical precision to assess injuries, staunch bleeding, and administer life-saving interventions. Yet, even in the midst of this frenzied ballet of medical expertise, an unsettling feeling began to take root, a sensation that something was profoundly awry. No matter how skilled and dedicated we were, it was as if the very essence of life had abandoned these unfortunate victims on that forsaken road. Their vital signs slipped through our fingers, fading like ethereal whispers into the inky night. One by one, they succumbed to their injuries, despite our valiant efforts to preserve their lives. The overwhelming sense of powerlessness that enveloped us was suffocating, leaving us with a bone-deep and eerie despair. The rain, which had been relentless from the onset of the incident, only intensified the overall sense of foreboding. Each raindrop seemed to carry a chilling weight, as though the storm itself had conspired against our efforts. The cold, insidious, and unyielding seeped into our very bones, amplifying the eerie atmosphere that hung over us like an oppressive shroud. As the hours crept forward, exhaustion began to encroach upon us, both physically and emotionally. We fought against insurmountable odds, struggling to preserve lives, yet it seemed that the battle was one we were destined to lose. The storm outside showed no mercy, its unrelenting fury unabated. It felt as though the elements themselves had turned against us, orchestrating a malevolent symphony of destruction. It was when the last victim was declared lifeless that the full magnitude of our nightmarish predicament became irrefutable. We stood in the dimly lit emergency room, our uniforms sodden and chilled to the bone. Faces etched with exhaustion and grief bore witness to an unspeakable tragedy. None of us could fully grasp the enormity of what had transpired that fateful night. An unsettling uncertainty settled upon us, casting a pall over the room. Adding to our growing unease, the hospital's interior lights flickered ominously and the backup generator reluctantly roared to life. In the ensuing darkness, we found ourselves disoriented and vulnerable. Thunder resonated outside, its menacing growls punctuated by jagged bursts of lightning that intermittently illuminated the room in stark, eerie relief. Within the ethereal glow of our flashlights, we heard them, the barely perceptible whispers that seemed to emanate from the shadows, the ghostly footsteps that echoed through the empty corridors. Unseen hands brushed against us, their touch as icy as the breath of death itself. It was as if the spirits of those we couldn't save had returned to claim us, pulling us inexorably towards an unfathomable abyss. Terrified and trembling, we huddled together, our breaths ragged, fully aware that there was no escape from the encroaching darkness. The relentless storm outside continued its merciless assault, and with each passing minute, our sense of impending doom grew more profound. That night in the emergency room, we found ourselves ensnared in a malevolent force, caught in a nightmarish limbo between the realm of the living and the shadowy domain of the dead. As we waited, paralyzed by fear, for our inexorable fate to unfurl, we couldn't help but wonder if our fateful encounter on that remote road had unwittingly invited something far more sinister into our lives. A relentless and malevolent force that would stop at nothing to exact its revenge. In the aftermath of that dreadful night on the remote road, our lives had changed irreversibly. The events in the emergency room had left us scarred, haunted by the chilling uncertainty of what had transpired. But little did we know that our encounter with the malevolent force was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, our once cohesive emergency room team began to fray at the edges. Sleepless nights and whispered conversations in the hospital corridors became the norm. We couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had latched onto us, an unseen menace lurking in the shadows. It began with subtle disturbances, a flickering light, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, and the occasional whispered word that no one could identify. At first, we dismissed these occurrences as mere coincidences, or the product of our frazzled nerves. But as they grew more frequent and pronounced, we couldn't deny the unsettling truth that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as I was checking on a patient in the dimly lit corridor, I heard it, a whisper that seemed to originate from the empty room nearby. "Help me!" it pleaded, the voice trembling with an otherworldly anguish. I turned toward the room, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find it empty. The door had swung open on its own accord, a chilling draft of cold air wafting through the room. Fear began to consume us, and we started to avoid the corridor where the voice had been heard. But the eerie phenomena followed us like a shadow, infiltrating every corner of the hospital. Lights would inexplicably shatter, and equipment malfunctioned without warning. The once reliable hospital PA system crackled to life with unsettling messages, often unintelligible but filled with an unmistakable sense of dread. It was during one particularly harrowing night shift that we began to feel a malevolent presence watching our every move. As we rushed to care for a critically ill patient, The room grew frigid, and our breaths became visible in the cold air. The patient's monitors emitted a deafening, high-pitched scream, their vital signs inexplicably plummeting. No amount of medical expertise could save them, and they joined the growing list of inexplicable fatalities. We gathered in the hospital's dimly lit break room, our faces etched with fear and exhaustion, and discussed what we had been experiencing. The consensus was unanimous. The malevolent force that had descended upon us on that stormy night had not relented. It had, in fact, intensified its grip on our lives. Desperation pushed us to seek answers. We combed through the hospital's history, discovering tales of tragedies and unexplained deaths that had occurred within its walls. Rumors circulated of a malevolent presence, a dark force that had plagued the hospital for generations. One name kept resurfacing, a nurse who had worked at the hospital decades ago. She had reportedly been consumed by grief after losing a patient during a brutal storm much like the one we had experienced. Legend had it that her tormented spirit still roamed the hospital's corridors, seeking retribution for her perceived failures. Haunted by these revelations, we decided to confront the lingering malevolence head-on. Armed with candles and ancient texts on exorcism borrowed from the local library, we ventured into the darkest corners of the hospital, searching for a way to free ourselves from the unseen menace. As we delved deeper into the labyrinthine sub-basements and disused wards, we began to feel a palpable sense of malevolence closing in on us. Whispers grew louder, and shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of our feeble candlelight. But we pressed on, determined to rid the hospital of the darkness that had tormented us for far too long. The conclusion of our terrifying ordeal lay ahead, shrouded in uncertainty. The malevolent force that had plagued us was real, and its malevolence had only grown stronger. We were about to confront a darkness that defied explanation, a presence that sought to consume us all. I've always had an appreciation for teeth, the way they can completely transform a person's face and smile. Ever since I was young, I found them fascinating, how braces could align crooked teeth into a perfect, dazzling grin. That childhood curiosity is what led me to pursue a career in orthodontics. I worked hard through dental school, motivated by my obsession with ideal tooth structure and occlusion. By the time I opened my own orthodontic practice, I had honed my skills to be able to take even the most dysfunctional mouths and craft them into orthodontic perfection. At first, I was satisfied helping teenagers and preteens achieve their best smiles. But over time, those ordinary corrections grew dull and unsatisfying. I knew I was capable of so much more. That's when the twisted thoughts started creeping in. Why should I waste my gift fixing insignificant overbites and crowding? My talents deserved a more worthy canvas, a truly superb set of teeth to transform into my ideal. I started casually scoping out patients, looking for that flawless base structure I could make my masterpiece. But braces alone felt insufficient. To truly perfect a smile required more ... invasive modifications. The first one was Melissa, 17, accepted into the dental program at her top choice university. She came to me for a standard strengthening of her pristine teeth before college. As I peered into her mouth, admiring each gleaming incisor, I knew this was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. After her braces were on, I waited a month for her teeth to settle before making my move. I told her we needed to do her first tightening and invited her back after hours when the office was empty. She trusted me completely as I locked the door behind her. She did try to scream at first when the nitrous oxide mask slid over her face, but soon she was limp and helpless, unable to resist as I got to work. I surgically split her palate to widen her perfect smile into an unnaturally broad rictus grin. I carefully filed her shining teeth into sharp points and inserted metal inserts to give them an otherworldly predator glint. By the end, her mouth was transformed into something monstrous, yet so exquisitely perfected. When she finally came to, Screaming around her metal rictus, I felt such a deep thrill at what I had created. I knew then I could never go back to mundane corrections. Melissa was just the first masterpiece of many. I soundproofed the office and invested in professional-grade anesthetics. In the 10 years since, I've lost count of my brilliant transformations on only the most flawless subjects. Their best smiles made even more beautiful through my modifications. Just last week, I brought young Eric here under the guise of an emergency repair. With his gorgeous dimples and naturally straight, pearly whites, he's my next perfect canvas. He'll wake up missing a few teeth, which I carefully extracted to complete my newest smiling marionette. I can't wait to see how the gaps enhance his already stunning grin. My collection grows more impressive every day. Their gratitude is plain to see through their shrieks of joy around mouthfuls of blood. I doubt any ordinary orthodontist appreciates teeth quite like I do. After all, perfection often requires sacrifice. I'm so proud of the smiles I've crafted over the years. The looming silhouette of the Monroeville power plant emerged out of the darkness as I drove along the deserted road. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the ominous structure. It was my first shift as a night security guard here, and a feeling of unease settled heavily in my gut. Just a year ago, disaster had struck this facility. A catastrophic accident during routine maintenance had triggered an explosion and resultant meltdown in the plant's main reactor. The Monroeville meltdown, as the media dubbed it, ultimately claimed the lives of 6 workers. Their deaths were ruled accidental, but rumors swirled that negligence and ignored safety warnings had led to the tragedy. As I parked and made my way inside, I couldn't ignore the creepy ambiance that permeated the plant. The cavernous turbine room, usually throbbing with the drone of machinery, was unnervingly silent. The metal walkways and railings were bathed in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. Looming in shadowy corners were the hulking, lifeless forms of the turbines, like ancient iron beasts lying dormant. My footsteps echoed through the stillness as I began my rounds. The deeper I went into the plant, the more its troubled history weighed on me. I imagined the now deceased workers moving through these same corridors just a year prior, unaware of their impending doom. Turning a corner, I came upon the sealed doors of the plant's control room. Police tape still crisscrossed the entrance, which had been closed off since the meltdown. Peering through the small windows, I could see the extent of the damage within. The walls and equipment were blackened and warped from the intense heat of the explosion. The acrid stench of burnt metal and chemicals permeated the air, even through the door. Standing here, outside this tragic epicenter, a strange chill raced down my spine despite the hot, heavy air. I could almost hear the alarms blaring and screams echoing through the panicked chaos as disaster unfolded. Shuddering, I moved on quickly from the grim sight. Later in my shift, I returned to the control room to check that the sealed door had not been tampered with. As I shone my flashlight along the warped walls, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly around me. My breath came out in frosty puffs as an icy draft swirled through the room. I spun around, sweeping my light across the space. Where was this freak, unnatural cold coming from? That's when I first heard it. A drawn-out, mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the ruined equipment itself. I stumbled back, a spike of fear piercing my heart. The unearthly cry rose and fell, like the pained howl of an injured beast. But undercutting it were distinct human tones, voices of anguish and despair. I fled the control room, my mind racing over what I had experienced. I told myself it was stress or fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But over subsequent nights, the phenomena only grew more intense. Flickering lights and cold spots became common occurrences in the most damaged parts of the plant. I frequently heard the echo of footsteps following just behind me, only to find no one there when I turned. Equipment activated inexplicably, keeping me on edge. But most chilling of all were the voices. Heart-wrenching pleas for help, sobbing whispers, mournful wails. They never fully formed into distinct words, yet they conveyed a deep sense of fear and suffering. I began dreading my shifts, feeling utterly helpless against these paranormal events. After a week of bizarre activity escalating, I decided to investigate where it all seemed focused: the sealed control room. Approaching the police tape across the door, I steeled my nerves before slipping under it. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something sinister haunted this place. Stepping inside, I swept my flashlight over the familiar burnt walls and equipment. "If any spirits are here, give me a sign," I whispered tentatively. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a bone-chilling rush of icy wind swirled through the room, scattering ash and debris. I shivered violently, arms prickling with goosebumps. That's when I saw them. Shadowy, human-like silhouettes gathered by the melted control panel. Their edges wavered like heat distortion, faces blurred and indistinct. But their anguished voices came through undeniably clear. "Why didn't they listen to us?" a shaken male voice lamented. "We told them the reactor was unstable." "It wasn't our fault," a woman's voice sobbed. "We were only doing our jobs when it exploded." My jaw hung open, and I sank to my knees. These were the spirits of the workers who had perished here, still trapped, reliving their final, terrified moments. In the nights that followed, I made contact with the lost souls whenever my shift took me past that sealed control room door. I brought offerings of flowers and candles, which seemed to calm their restless energy. Sometimes we would talk, and in their spectral voices I heard the full tragedy of what had occurred. Piece by piece, I gathered the truth. Negligent management had ignored the workers' safety concerns. On that fateful day, fail-safe after fail-safe catastrophically malfunctioned, triggering the deadly meltdown. Fearing for their jobs, the workers had kept quiet until it was too late. The spirits clung to this place out of the injustice of their deaths. They needed someone to hear their truth without judgment and remember them as more than victims of an accident. I made it my duty to give them that peace. On my last night shift at the plant, I left a plaque honoring each lost soul by name. They had entrusted me with their unresolved pain, and I hoped I had helped them find some solace. As I drove away from the looming plant that final dawn, I knew the truth of what had happened there. And I knew the spirits trapped within could now rest, their truth acknowledged, their voices finally heard. The Monroeville meltdown would haunt me forever, but now as a tragedy that through understanding could evoke change, not fear. Across the cityscape, the hulking tower rose with smooth lines and stark angles, throwing a dark silhouette over everything on the ground. The many men who punched in here day after day, their aspirations, their desires, what they kept hidden even from themselves inside. This beastly edifice spoke in the dead of night when all its inhabitants were absent. Mark, the stoic third-shift security guard, chuckled off stories about ghosts as wild imaginations and never believed such things could possibly be real. Reason was his shield and doubt his armor. Unbeknownst to him, the structure was harboring secrets which would soon make a spectacle of his skepticism. It started out small, with a little whisper. On one moonless evening, he walked through an empty corridor with his footsteps reverberating eerily. The whispers at first were just the wind playing tricks on him. However, as he neared their ear, the rumors became tangible, spoken in ghostly lip service, creating a labyrinth of tales in the shadows. The hair stood up on the back of his neck, but thinking it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, Mark pushed on and finished his walk, blaming the scary noises on over-imaginative exhaustion. It's not an uncommon condition in Florida. The whisper grew day in and night out, until the speed increased like the slow beating of a funeral bell in the distance. They crept out of obscured angles and floated through darkened corridors, filling Mark with an unsettling, nauseating feeling. The sounds, incomprehensible to the ear, as always, conveyed a sense of suffering. They seemed to be lost souls who never left this plane of existence. Inquiry and doubt urged him past the limits of sanity. He walked into a vast, transparent room at the top of this building, famous for having been the last location seen of an executive. As he stepped in, a cacophony of whispers swelled into a discordant orchestra with an icy draft filling the room. Shadowy dancers floated silently in the moonlight that spilt into the room. These ghosts fluttered, dancing like candle flames in the wind, as fleeting as cigarette smoke. Mark gasped a lungful of air. He wasn't the only one. And they were definitely ghosts, for such were the source of the incessant whispering. The phantoms had to be faced, said Mark, and he summoned up all of his courage. "Who are you? Who the hell are you, and what do you want?" he yelled. The spirits were mute, but nodded from side to side as they recognized the man's arrival. Then he spotted an antique table covered with dust in the corner, piles of papers and files scattered. In among these papers was a letter, written by the missing boss and sent just prior to his inexplicable disappearance. It was a statement, an admission of theft, corruption, practices which had caused the demise of the enterprise. He says, "Guilt, weighing on him as heavy as the darkness in the room, made the executive lose their mind and ultimately meet death in those same room." The murmurs grew louder until they were a crazed din, right on top of Mark as he looked down and read her letter. Their tortured faces seemed to beg him to discover the secret and take revenge on the bastard who was in charge. Mark knew all too well their cry for justice. The following days, Mark presented the disastrous letter to his bosses, which led to a probe. His legacy of corruption and web of deceit unraveled, the executive is done and dusted. As facts were revealed, the rumors subsided. They had served their purpose as the ghosts disappeared. Mark's experience changed him permanently, wiping out his cynicism and branding with him the harrowing story. He knew the secrets of the office building deepened at night, when the whispers from the past called out to him and malevolent spirits lurked deep within the shadows. I'm sharing my bone-chilling experience on Reddit as a cautionary tale for those who don't take tales of haunted dwellings seriously. My time in apartment 13 taught me that sometimes the veil between worlds wears thin, allowing unseen horrors to creep into our reality. When I first toured the apartment, located in a crumbling pre-war building, I was too dazzled by the reasonable rent and downtown location to notice any eerie vibe. The unit was a bit outdated, with creaky hardwood floors and drafty windows, but I figured that gave it character. Having just graduated college, I was thrilled to gain independence in a hip neighborhood at a price I could afford. At first, the quirks of the place seemed harmless, even charming. Door hinges groaned noisily whenever a breeze blew, which lent a cozy ambiance, like an old house settling in for the night. Distant conversations from neighboring units created a comforting sense of community. The building breathed with life despite its advanced age, but gradually, I became aware of sounds that didn't quite belong. Footsteps echoed from vacant floors above mine late at night, too solid to be ignored as the building's settling. I'd jolt awake convinced someone was right outside my bedroom, only to find nothing but silence hovering in the hall. Whispers emanated from corners of rooms where no one could possibly hide. I'd whip around quickly, seeking the source, but never caught more than a fading hiss. Friends claimed they heard nothing odd, so I wrote it off as the overactive imagination of a new renter. The sensations intensified slowly, interspersed with weeks of normalcy that lured me into complacency. A creeping melancholy infused the apartment that no amount of cheerful decor could dispel. I found myself making excuses not to spend time there, dawdling at the office or accepting any happy hour invitation after work. I dreaded returning to that oppressive solitude. One frigid night in deep December, I awoke to an utterly silent apartment. Snow blanketed the courtyard outside, muffling the usual city hum. But that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the total absence of those uncanny creaks and groans that constituted the building's nocturnal voice. Like a living being, it now held its breath. Shivering with more than cold, I sat up in bed, straining to hear any reassuring nighttime sounds. But there was only my own pounding heartbeat pulsing in my ears. The unnatural hush felt heavy, pregnant with anticipation of some unknowable horror. I did not sleep again that long night. When I confided in the building manager, he revealed that another renter had fled apartment 13 just 1 month before I'd moved in. She left unexpectedly in the dead of night, never returning to collect her belongings. No forwarding address was on record. The manager assured me no tragedy or crime had occurred to prompt her departure. But from then on, I noticed his uneasy glances at the door to hash 13, as if half expecting it to swing open by itself. His shakes of the head told me not to ask further questions, just to endure my lease and leave the mysteries of the place unexplored. But I could no longer ignore the signs of a presence that lurked in those walls alongside me. My showers inexplicably ran ice cold, the bathroom mirror fogged over with disembodied words. Fingers of frost crept across window panes despite the heat being cranked high. The welcoming apartment I'd moved into became a different place entirely. On a night when the wind howled fiercely around the century-old eaves, I understood the spirit's identity in a dreadful epiphany. The previous tenant hadn't departed. She was still here with me now, unseen, her restless essence haunting the very floors she once walked. I burned sage in every corner, uttering prayers I only half recalled from childhood. But the disturbances only worsened, no longer stealthy but brazen. Pots and pans crashed to the kitchen floor. Disembodied footsteps paced angrily overhead. My name rang out desperately in the empty rooms. That night, waking to an utterly unnatural cold engulfing my bed, I saw a shadowy figure looming over me. Translucent hands reached for my throat, as if acting out her own fate. I screamed myself hoarse, beyond hearing the racket that brought neighbors pounding on the door. But once inside, they heard only the wind moaning outside the shuddering panes. Of course, I concealed the full truth about the entity tormenting me as sleep deprivation took its toll. No one could understand the all-consuming dread that permeated apartment 13, leeching away all warmth and sanity. No average ghost story captured the primal evil radiating from those walls, so ancient and hungry. Begging release from my lease, I swallowed my pride and concealed nothing from the manager. His face blanched as I described flickering shadows that scuttled like roaches when I turned on lights. Even he could not deny the apartment's atmosphere had changed drastically since the previous tenant vanished that winter night. He agreed to let me break my lease, provided I spoke of it no further. But I could not restrain my story entirely, despite the incredulity it provoked, whispered online to those who dared believe. My account drew out others who'd suffered similar ordeals in innocuous apartments that harbored unseen menace. We found strength sharing our tales, proof we were neither liars nor insane. Some proposed theories on the true nature of what had infiltrated my home and psyche. Ancient evils that seeped into cracks between realities, manifesting as poltergeists, demons, or hungry ghosts. Whatever its origin, the entity had possessed that place, claiming it as a lair in which to torment the living. In the end, I fled that building altogether, unwilling to linger in its haunted orbit. I drove far out of town to stay with a friend while searching for a new apartment, leaving no forwarding address. Whatever malevolent force dwelt in those walls, I had no wish to remain its plaything, or worse, become another lost spirit whispering in its shadows. Though I told myself I'd escaped intact, in truth, my nights have not been the same since encountering that shapeless horror. I awake gripped by dread, my bedroom filled with unseen eyes peering from the darkest corners. Wisps of cold fingers trace down my neck. Unnatural croaks issue from empty closets. Desperate, I contact spiritual advisors to cleanse my new home, but their smudging and prayers only offer temporary relief. The entity I disturbed has marked me, clinging to my soul long after I abandoned apartment 13. It knows I briefly glimpsed the writhing chaos at the heart of its reality that drives minds mad. I know too much now to entirely belong to this sane mortal world. If you ever find yourself living amid such inexplicable disturbances, pray you have the wisdom to flee quickly. Do not convince yourself your mind is playing tricks, or that you can solve the mystery rationally. Protect your sanity above all else. before the entity twists your thoughts toward darkness. No earthly logic applies to these hungry things that infiltrate our reality through cracks too small to see. They crave fear and worship from us, like demons of antiquity. Resist the allure of communing with them or probing their unknowable motives. Detach yourself from their realm completely, for they will pursue your essence through many dwellings, attracted to your light. Call them ghosts, specters, demons, whatever name brings comfort against the unnameable. But rest assured they lurk in far more homes than commonly believed, feasting on despair. Their true feast comes when they sufficiently poison a mind toward utter madness, a state they relish. Never lose sight of your own essence while in their clutches. Some say they visit retribution on the wicked, but such judgment is not for them to dispense. Their wickedness is of a deeper strain, divorced utterly from human morality, though they will fake such principles to manipulate you. To them, we are mere cattle to be fed upon until our minds and life force are drained. Do not be fooled into pardoning their parasitic ways. Flee at the very first sign of their tricks seeping through the plaster, the whispers in the static of your radio, glinting eyes in the dark. Shut your ears to their seductive lies and silence. No answers worth gleaning exist in their howling void. Your sanity is the only thing worth preserving, at any cost. Let seekers of forbidden mysteries succumb to the dark if they're so eager to look within. Guard your mental landscape against their intrusive fingerprints so you don't carry their taint within you for life. Those of us who came too close, yet managed to break free, must be vigilant. We only sleep now with one eye open, peppering holy water across each threshold and windowsill. We jump at every unexplained creak, our fight-or-flight reflexes hair-triggered. But such hypervigilance is the price of being marked by wolves. Let my folly caution you against engaging with those chaotic forces. Keep your distance lest they infect your blood, reduce you to a nervous wretch or gibbering lunatic haunted till death, never belonging fully to either world. Better to live in ignorant daylight than endure what I have known. That just one closed door away, hellish dimensions writhe, their denizens hungry for our precious life essences, craving ownership of our vulnerable souls. Even a thin wall stands as fortress if you harbor no curiosity about the infernal dominion it conceals. Board up your ears to muffled cries within abandoned rooms where you once slept. Forget their cold caresses down your throat and feverish whispers offering poisoned knowledge. Sever all cords to those lightless realms, lest their claws dig into your spirit, dragging you back through a crack too narrow to breach unless invited. Do not repeat my dire mistake of lingering, entertaining their spectral thrall once alerted to their presence. Run and keep running until you find an untainted domicile far from their oozing grasp. Only then may you, with luck, evade their patient invasion of your thoughts, your dreams, your soul. So I caution you in the strongest terms to flee the first signs of their trickery. Ignore false comfort offered by those trapped in denial. The burden lies on you alone to discern their deception and break away completely, if you care at all for the fate of your sanity. You alone can shut them out for good, refusing all further contact. For they will always want more than you can give without losing your very self. Remember this when you hear the 3 a.m. whispers and footsteps outside your room. Recall my warning when the wheedling voices implore you answer their call. Deny them, and you will keep sacred the life force granted you. Submit yourself, and who knows what infernal pacts you may unwittingly seal, surrendering your delicate soul. Protect it with utter conviction, no matter the lure dangled before you. Only then, having severed all ties to those fiends in the darkness, may you again sleep undisturbed by nightmares not your own. Silence. Their siren songs with eternal resolve. Let evil fester untended in lightless realms. Seek your bliss only under the sun, fleeting yet warming your skin. Cherish each breath gifted you beneath the open sky. Give no quarter to those patient demons who salivate for your pain. They own nothing you do not first surrender. It was a cold October night when Frank set out on the long haul from Dallas to Chicago. He had made this trip hundreds of times before without incident, but this time felt different. As he merged onto the highway, the full moon overhead cast an eerie glow on the darkened landscape. With 500 miles of open road ahead, Frank settled in for the long, lonely night of driving. Little did he know the terror that awaited him out there in the darkness. Frank turned up the radio to keep him company through the monotonous night. He hummed along absent-mindedly to a familiar tune, the music unable to fully distract him from the isolation of the open highway. Not a soul could be seen for miles in either direction at this late hour. The dotted yellow lines of the highway stretched on endlessly towards the horizon, swallowed up by the darkness. As the hours passed uneventfully, Frank began to grow drowsy behind the wheel. Just as Frank's eyelids grew heavy, a light flashed in his rearview mirror. Another truck was approaching quickly from behind. Frank sat up straight, suddenly alert as the truck roared past him, missing his bumper by mere inches. He caught a glimpse of writing on the back door as it whizzed by, but it was gone before he could make out what it said. Uneasy, Frank changed lanes to allow plenty of space between him and the erratic truck driver. Up ahead, Frank spotted a rest stop and decided to pull over for some coffee. As he parked the truck, the other semi pulled in as well. Frank watched warily as a gaunt, bearded man in a flannel shirt climbed out of the cab. Their eyes met briefly before the stranger turned and headed toward the rest stop building. Frank felt a chill run down his spine, unsure why the man's presence unsettled him so. Shaking it off, he headed inside for a much-needed coffee refill. Back on the highway, Frank kept checking his mirrors nervously, half expecting to see the mysterious truck reappear behind him. The miles of pitch darkness and isolation preyed on his nerves. He flipped on the radio again, searching for a station to keep him company, but all he heard was static. After endless twisting and turning of the dial yielded nothing, he snapped it off in frustration. It was then he noticed the strange odor, a sickly, sweet, decaying smell that seemed to cling to the inside of the cab. Frank rolled down the windows, hoping the rush of cold night air would eliminate the stench. But if anything, the smell grew stronger, almost overpowering in its putrid sweetness. Frank began to feel ill, his stomach churning and head throbbing. He longed for the familiar glow of city lights on the horizon, but he was still hours from Chicago. As the awful smell worsened, Frank realized to his horror that it was emanating from the trailer of his truck. But what could possibly be back there emitting such a nauseating odor? Pulling over at the next chance he got, Frank knew he had to investigate the source of the smell. Leaving the cab running, he walked cautiously along the side of the trailer. He hesitated as he reached for the door handle, fearing what might be waiting inside. The stench was overpowering now, like rotten, decaying flesh. Holding his breath, Frank tugged open the trailer door and flipped on the light inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, strewn across the floor of the trailer, were the butchered remains of human bodies. Frank recoiled in horror. Shock rooted him temporarily frozen to the spot. Hacked up limbs, torn flesh, congealed blood were scattered haphazardly around the trailer. The sickly, sweet stench was overpowering now, choking Frank as he grasped the door to keep himself from collapsing. After what felt like an eternity, Frank stumbled back to the cab and fumbled for his phone to call 911. But just as Frank's shaking hand grabbed the phone, a sudden tapping at the passenger side window made his heart nearly stop. Whipping his head around, he saw the bearded trucker from the rest stop leering in at him. The man's gaunt face was expressionless, his dark, sunken eyes cold and hollow. Slowly, he raised one bony finger and dragged it menacingly across his own throat while holding Frank's petrified gaze. Letting out a strangled cry, Frank fumbled desperately to slam the truck into gear and stomp the gas pedal to the floor. He had to get away from this murderous lunatic no matter what. The tires squealed as the semi lurched forward, spewing dust and gravel as it left the sinister stranger behind. Frank's mind reeled, his horrified thoughts racing as fast as his pounding pulse. Had that hollow-eyed psycho put the butchered bodies in his trailer? Was he sent to permanently silence the only witness to his horrific crimes? Frank's heart hammered against his ribs, hands slippery with cold sweat on the wheel, as the truck roared onwards into the night. He was too terrified to slow down even an inch, convinced he had to keep going until he reached the safety of the city. Miles later, with the needle buried deep in the red, Frank raced onwards, fueled only by pure adrenaline. The sickly stench still filled the cab, inescapably lingering like a constant chilling reminder of the gruesome cargo in the back. But now ahead in the distance, the Chicago skyline shone on the horizon, filling Frank with desperate relief. Once inside the city limits, he could alert the authorities and this hellish nightmare would finally be over. White-knuckled on the wheel, eyes darting constantly to the mirrors, he watched for any sign of headlights bearing down behind him. At long last, heart still pounding from terror, Frank passed beneath the familiar Chicago city limits sign. He breathed a deep sigh of relief, beyond grateful to be back among the living after the harrowing events of the night. As he steered the truck towards the depot, he could hardly wait to be rid of the grisly, rotting cargo in the trailer. He desperately tried to push the gruesome images from his mind, praying the authorities could somehow make sense of the unspeakable horrors he had witnessed. For now, bathed in welcoming city lights, he was just thankful to have escaped that isolated highway of terror with his life. But the shadowy, gripping fear of that sinister, bearded trucker would linger over Frank for a very long time. Still reeling from the bone-chilling, traumatic events of the night, Frank pulled his rumbling semi into the depot parking lot, just as the first rays of dawn were breaking over Chicago. He staggered weakly out of the cab on unsteady, shaky legs, desperate to get as far away as humanly possible from the grisly, rotting cargo in his trailer. As he slowly made his way across the lot towards the depot office, he tried in vain to wipe the haunting image of the wild-eyed, bearded man and his cold, hollow eyes from his mind. After being awake for over 24 tense, harrowing hours, Frank was mentally and physically exhausted. But through the fog of fatigue, he knew he urgently needed to alert the authorities before that murderous lunatic could somehow track him down again. Inside the small, dingy depot office, Frank frantically explained in vivid detail the macabre discovery in his trailer to the dispatcher on duty. Though initially skeptical of Frank's bizarre, unbelievable account, the dispatcher immediately called Chicago PD once the first patrol cars arrived and the trailer doors creaked open. The hardened officers reeled back in horror upon seeing the nightmarish scene. Countless hacked up, dismembered body parts and decomposing limbs strewn haphazardly across the entire trailer floor. The overpowering stench of decay overwhelmed the officers, causing several to double over and vomit as they scrambled to cordon off the entire loading dock. This was no longer just a routine call. It was clear now that a profoundly disturbed, maniacal killer was on the loose. While anxiously waiting to give his official recorded statement, Frank's mind raced uncontrollably as he agonized over how the mutilated bodies ended up hidden in his trailer. He had stopped at several rest areas to refuel along his route that night. Had that hollow-eyed, bearded freak slipped into his unlocked trailer and hidden the bodies during one of those stops? Or even worse, could Frank have possibly been unknowingly transporting those poor, slaughtered souls over hundreds of miles in the back of his rig the entire drive from Dallas? A fresh wave of nausea washed over him as he imagined the deranged butcher secretly stowing his victims right under his nose, working just feet away to dismember them in the trailer. Hours later, completely drained both emotionally and physically from recounting every chilling detail to the police, all Frank wanted was to go straight home and barricade himself securely inside. But when he wearily shuffled up to his front door and entered his house, his blood instantly turned to ice. The entire place had been completely ransacked, furniture slashed and overturned, belongings ripped open and strewn everywhere, windows smashed in. It was painfully clear that someone had methodically searched the place looking for something specific. As his pulse pounded in his ears, Frank realized with dawning dread that it could only have been one person responsible. The maniacal bearded trucker had already tracked him down to silence him forever. Frank knew there was no way he could stay there another minute. The crazed trucker was likely still lurking somewhere nearby, watching the house, biding his time before striking again. Hands shaking, Frank grabbed his keys off the kitchen counter and got back into his pickup, peeling out of the driveway. He needed to get somewhere. Anywhere. to lay low for a while until the police finally caught the deranged psycho killer who had shattered his nerves. After agonizing over where to possibly go, Frank decided fleeing upstate to his cousin's remote, secluded cabin was his best option. Surely no one would ever find him there. It was his only real shot at buying time for his frayed panic to subside before he could even begin to mentally process getting behind the wheel of a semi-truck again. The anxious drive to the cabin was pure torment for Frank's rattled mind. Every single pair of headlights that appeared in his rearview mirror made his pulse quicken and muscles tense as he imagined the remorseless killer chasing him down again. Gripping the wheel white-knuckled, he drove erratically and much too fast, wanting to put as many miles between himself and the city as humanly possible. Only once the bright glow of Chicago's skyline had faded into pitch darkness in his back mirror could Frank finally breathe a small sigh of relief. Out here alone in the middle of nowhere, surely he was safe from that maniac at long last. Arriving at the cabin, Frank's frayed nerves had him jumping at even the smallest noises, tree branches scraping on the roof, the wind whistling around the eaves. Like a man possessed, he frantically barricaded himself inside, drawing all the curtains and double-checking that every door and window was locked up tight. With each passing hour spent hidden away, his panic gradually began to subside, knowing there was no way the killer could have followed him this far into the wilderness. Yet gruesome visions of those severed limbs and the hollow-eyed stranger still plagued his thoughts relentlessly. He tossed and turned in fitful spurts all night long, grateful when morning's light finally crept in through the windows. After spending 3 straight sleepless, paranoid nights there at the cabin, Frank finally decided he had to return to the city soon. He couldn't hide away from reality forever. The authorities had likely tracked down the deranged killer and arrested him by now after such a huge investigation. He was desperate for any possible updates on the case, any assurances that the bearded man was securely behind bars and no longer posed a threat. Mustering his courage, Frank steeled himself for the dreaded drive back, trying to convince his frayed nerves that the police surely had things under control after all this time. Arriving back on the outskirts of Chicago, Frank was shocked to see squad cars still surrounding his trailer at the depot, cops combing it for any possible forensic evidence. He learned to his horror that the killer was somehow still at large. There had been absolutely 0 breaks in the investigation so far. Now the police had Frank under constant surveillance in case the maniac returned to permanently silence the sole living witness. But even with all their resources, they seemed no closer to any answers about the killer's twisted motives or victims, let alone apprehending the lunatic. In an attempt to regain some sense of normalcy, Frank hesitantly attempted to carry on working, taking short local delivery jobs around the Chicago area. But being back out on the open road filled him with a nameless, paralyzing dread. He found himself constantly pulling over to frantically check that the trailer doors were securely locked and chained. Gripping the wheel white-knuckled, he drove uneasily, compulsively scouring every passing rest stop and parking lot for any sign of the wild-eyed bearded man. With each job, Frank's anxiety worsened until he finally outright refused to drive any semi-routes at all, plagued by traumatic flashbacks. As the weeks dragged on, there were still no meaningful breaks in the investigation. Each night, without fail, the chilling face of the bearded man haunted Frank's restless nightmares, always lurking just out of sight, forever beyond his reach. Frank slowly came to the painful realization that he would never feel safe on a highway again until the deranged killer was finally caught once and for all. But clearly, the police were utterly helpless in tracking the maniac down. At long last, Frank knew he had to take matters into his own hands. It was time to turn the tables and do the unthinkable. He would hunt the hunter. Frank began deliberately driving back and forth along the desolate Dallas-Chicago route where the nightmare had all started, hoping to finally lure the psychopath out of hiding. He pushed the semi to reckless, dangerous speeds, brazenly welcoming any chance the maniac might rear his head again. Alone in the pitch darkness once more, Frank's fraying mind actually hoped for another confrontation with the monster. He knew facing his tormentor was the only possible way to reclaim any sense of power and sanity. This time, he would be ready. 2 agonizing weeks passed with no sign of his target. Then, Pulling into a familiar rest stop outside St. Louis to refuel, a chill ran down Frank's spine. There, parked casually next to his truck, was an all-too-familiar bearded man. Frank's chest tightened, pulse instantly racing as their eyes briefly met. This was the moment he had been waiting for. After being the hunted for so long, it was finally time for him to make the killer the prey. Tonight would be the end, for better or worse. Frank quietly slipped a tire iron from the back of his cab, gripping the cold steel tightly to stop his hands from shaking. He slowly began creeping up unseen behind the unsuspecting man, each step filling his veins with adrenaline. His last shreds of reason urged him to run, but the thirst for revenge drowned it out. Approaching within striking distance, Frank raised the iron high above his head, readying a brutal blow with every ounce of rage in his body. But just as he swept down with all his might, the man spun around with inhuman speed and caught Frank's arm in an iron vice grip. The tire iron clattered to the ground as the man fixed Frank with his cold, hollow eyes. His face broke into a sadistic grin as he effortlessly forced Frank to his knees. Frank struggled against the vice-like grip, but the man was inhumanly strong. As he stared up into the dark, bottomless eyes of the killer, Frank pleaded desperately for his life. But his cries fell on deaf ears. The man wrapped his powerful hands around Frank's throat and began mercilessly choking the life from him. Frank frantically clawed and scratched at the man's arms, drawing blood, but it did nothing to loosen the unbreakable stranglehold. As the last bits of air wheezed from his lungs, Frank's bulging eyes remained locked on the bearded face of his killer. The man took obvious delight in slowly draining the life from his victim. Just before the world faded to black, Frank's gaze fell upon the back of the man's jacket. Faded writing that he had not noticed before came into focus. Illinois State Coroner's Office. As the chilling realization dawned on him, a final panicked gurgle escaped Frank. The reports were wrong. This was no random, deranged killer. This monster had access to the bodies, the resources to move them undetected, the inside knowledge to hunt Frank down. The man staring back at him with delight as he choked the life away was no trucker at all. He was a twisted psychopath, hiding in plain sight inside the coroner's office. Frank's body went limp as the light left his eyes. At long last, the coroner released his iron grip and let Frank's body fall to the ground with a sickening thud. He straightened up slowly, a look of satisfaction on his face at another successful hunt. There would be no further interference in his gruesome operations. Without so much as a backward glance, the coroner strode away into the night, leaving Frank's lifeless body behind in the dirt. The demon who had hidden behind a uniform would kill again. But for now, Frank's tragic story had reached its end. In the moonlit expanse of the Arizona desert, decades ago, I found myself standing at the crossroads of fear and courage. My heart raced as I navigated the rugged terrain, the wind carrying with it an eerie melody that seemed to echo the secrets of the land. It was on a night much like this that I encountered the Skinwalker, a creature of darkness with eyes that glowed like smoldering embers. Its presence exuded a malevolence that sent shivers down my spine, testing my resolve as I faced a force beyond imagination. Armed with the ancient wisdom passed down through generations, I stood my ground, heart pounding like the distant drums of a battle about to unfold. The creature taunted me, its voice shifting into the haunting echoes of my loved ones. Doubt crept in, memories of family flooding my mind, but deep within, a fire of determination burned, unyielding as the mountains surrounding me. With incantations recited and talismans raised, I channeled the spirits of my ancestors, ready to wage war against the encroaching darkness. The clash of wills was like a storm on the horizon, nature itself echoing the battle between good and evil. The Skinwalker's forms shifted grotesquely, trying to break my spirit. But with each transformation, my resolve only grew stronger. The night stretched on, each moment heavy with anticipation, as if the very fabric of time held its breath. Finally, With a final incantation, a blinding light burst forth, forcing the skinwalker to retreat into the shadows. I stood victorious, though forever scarred by the encounter. I knew that the creature's malevolence would linger, a shadow waiting for the opportunity to reclaim what it believed to be its due. Years passed, the desert winds whispering the tales of old. And as fate would have it, my grandchild found themselves drawn to the same desolate landscape, the tendrils of the skinwalker's vengeance curling around their destiny. Unbeknownst to them, the ancient evil sought to settle a score, the memories of our encounter seeping through the earth like a poison. Subtle at first, rustlings in the night, chilling whispers on the wind. Dreams haunted by glowing eyes and shifting shadows. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and my grandchild felt the same malevolence I had once faced. Driven by a desperate need to protect them, they unraveled the truth of our family's past, the legacy of courage that had been passed down through generations. Armed with the same incantations and talismans, they embarked on a journey to confront the same malevolent force that had once sought me. The final confrontation arrived beneath a blood moon, the sky painted a sinister crimson. With each incantation, the tension grew thicker, the air charged with ancient power. The skinwalker emerged, its form flickering between grotesque shapes. Its eyes bore into my grandchild's soul, but they stood firm, fortified by a legacy of resilience. A symphony of light and darkness unfolded, a dance of ancient foes. With every incantation, they pushed back against the encroaching evil, determined to break the cycle of fear that had plagued our family. And in a blinding crescendo, their voice intertwined with mine. The skinwalker let out a wail of defeat before dissipating into the night. The moon returned to its silvery glow, the winds now whispering songs of triumph. My grandchild stood as a testament to the strength of family, the power of courage, and the unwavering resilience of the human spirit. When I started my medical residency, I was determined to become the best doctor I could be. I idolized Dr. Reynolds, the prestigious chief of surgery at my hospital. His skill in the OR was unparalleled, and he took me under his wing as his protege. I was honored by his mentorship and soaked up every pearl of wisdom. The day everything changed started like any other. I scrubbed in with Dr. Reynolds to assist on a routine appendectomy. But during the procedure, I noticed him deviate from standard protocol. He improperly ligated blood vessels and left perforations unchecked. Internal bleeding continued even after the patient was closed up. In the recovery room, the patient took a turn for the worse. Dr. Reynolds ordered us not to take him back to the OR, but instead to try and stabilize him without reopening. I knew he was too unstable, yet no one questioned the chief of surgery. Within the hour, the patient had died from blood loss. In the following weeks, I saw more similar cases. Surgical complications, bordering on malpractice, that Dr. Reynolds refused to address properly. Each poor outcome was covered up in paperwork, attributing it to pre-existing conditions in otherwise stable patients. No one dared contradict the legendary surgeon. Except for me. After a particularly egregious case that left a young mother permanently disabled, I decided I had to speak up. My career ambitions paled in comparison to my duty as a doctor. I scheduled a meeting with the hospital administrators and outlined every instance of malpractice I had witnessed. The backlash was swift. Dr. Reynolds denied all accusations and used his clout to discredit me. I was labeled as incompetent, a resentful trainee lashing out with false claims against a respected physician. My residency was put on probation, future career prospects swiftly evaporating. Each day I questioned if I had made the right choice. I loved medicine and had worked so hard to get here. Now everything was collapsing around me. But how could I stay silent, knowing patients were being harmed? I wrestled with self-doubt but knew that under it all, I cared more about doing what was right. The turning point came when another resident approached me privately. They had witnessed Dr. Reynolds' errors too, but had been too afraid to come forward until now. One by one, others came to tell me their stories, emboldened by my stand for truth. an independent investigation was launched. My claims were substantiated by testimony from dozens of staff and patients. By the time they presented conclusive evidence against him, Dr. Reynolds had no choice but to surrender his medical license and resign. Justice had prevailed because I found the courage to speak out against a broken system, even when it jeopardized my career. The fallout was not easy. I had to rebuild my professional reputation and work tirelessly to complete my residency under the shadow of controversy. But I have no regrets. The hardest decisions require sacrifice. I chose integrity over ambition or loyalty. Now I have the privilege of running an ethical department that puts patient safety first. My advice to all aspiring physicians is to never compromise your moral compass. The lives of those we serve must come before personal gain. Promise that if you see wrongdoing, you will step forward, no matter how difficult. Protecting the truth and the vulnerable will always be worth the cost. Medicine needs good doctors willing to blow the whistle. My eyes flew open to a blinding light. I jolted upright, heart pounding, only to be wrenched back down by thick leather straps securing me to a gurney. The pungent stench of antiseptic burned my nostrils as my blurry vision adjusted to reveal a room lined with intricate medical equipment. Where was I? How did I get here? I racked my brain trying to remember anything from before I blacked out, but my mind was a blank slate. A shadow crept across the wall. I craned my neck just in time to see a skeletal figure in a lab coat scuttle into the darkness. This was no hospital. I thrashed against the straps with all my might, but they wouldn't budge. The leather cut into my skin as I writhed in desperation. Footsteps echoed from the darkness. A raspy voice whispered, "There's no point fighting. Your fate is sealed." A gnarled hand clasped my forehead, holding me still. A syringe plunged into my neck, sending an icy venom into my veins. The world melted away, dissolving into inky black tendrils. They wrapped around my consciousness, pulling me into an endless void. I hurtled through an expanse of infinite darkness. Suddenly, the void shattered like glass. I was standing in an eerily familiar hallway. The paint peeled off the dingy walls in ribbons. Dusty fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A kid's haunting melody drifted from around the corner. No, it couldn't be. This was the psychiatric hospital I stayed in as a teen, a place I hoped to forget. I inched toward the nursery room, each step dredging up traumatic memories I had buried for so long. The closer I got, the more the walls oozed with blood. The nursery door hung ajar, revealing shadows dancing across the room. Monsters from my childhood nightmares were lurking inside. I wanted to run, but my feet dragged me forward. I crossed the threshold into blinding light once more. But this was no hospital room. I was strapped onto a rickety roller coaster, careening down a track lined with flames. A booming voice echoed overhead. "Face your fears, or be devoured by them." The roller coaster raced toward a gaping pit filled with gnashing teeth and tentacled beasts. I strained against the bar, holding me down as we teetered on the edge of the abyss. With a desperate scream, I ripped free just as the coaster plummeted into oblivion. But my relief was short-lived. I spun around to see the entire amusement park morphing into a hellish landscape straight out of Bosch's paintings. Grotesque creatures watched me with malevolent eyes. The world was twisting into a living nightmare, and I was trapped inside. How long I endured that sadistic ride through my darkest fears, I cannot say. Time lost all meaning. I clung to my sanity as demonic illusions left me bruised, bloodied, and trembling. Just when I thought I could take no more, a blinding light enveloped me, wrenching me back to the gurney. I lay there, soaked in sweat, every nerve raw, as footsteps approached once more. Through swollen eyes, I saw that skeletal man in the lab coat leering down at me. Comprehension dawned. This was no nightmare. It was a diabolical experiment devised by a psychopath. Anger simmered in my gut. No more. I would not be tortured again. In one explosive push, I snapped the leather restraints and lunged at my captor's throat. We crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. I scrambled for leverage, fueled by white-hot rage. In the chaos, my hand closed around a scalpel on the instrument tray. One swift slash and I left the madman gurgling in a pool of his own blood. I staggered out of that house of horrors weakened and wounded, but finally free from the nightmare. The twisted experiment was over. I was scarred, but stronger. Next time I would not wait to fight back against the darkness. I posted this chilling encounter on Reddit to warn others who might be tempted to dabble in forces they don't understand. My terrifying experience with a Ouija board is a cautionary tale that still haunts my dreams. It started out as a laugh, a way to scare ourselves one dark October night. My friends and I were bored, looking for a cheap thrill. Ouija boards seemed harmless enough, just a silly party game. We never imagined what would happen when we opened doors that should have remained closed. We gathered at my friend Mike's creaky old Victorian house on the edge of town. It was the perfect setting for our occult experiment, with flaking paint, groaning floorboards, and drafty halls that whistled eerily. We joked about summoning spirits as we settled into the dank basement, lit only by a few trembling candles. Mike produced the Ouija board with a flourish, laying the worn cardboard rectangle on the floor. The letters and numbers were faded, the wood planchette chipped. We snickered as we placed our fingers upon it, asking cliché questions in squeaky voices, mimicking what we thought ghosts sounded like. But our derisive laughter soon faded as the planchette remained still beneath our fingers. The dusty basement air seemed to grow heavier as the candles guttered. We posed questions, waiting in vain for any movement. The night seemed colder, and I drew my jacket tighter around my shoulders. Suddenly, the planchette quivered, then slowly crept across the board, making us gasp. It glided surely, no one guiding it, to spell out, yes. My unease grew as it answered more questions intelligently, giving a name, Anna, and saying it was a child spirit. My friends tried to hide their nerves with laughter, making jokes about cheap tricks. But our snickers grew half-hearted and hollow. Each answer was articulate and clear, sliding effortlessly to letters far from each other. There was an eerie purposefulness, too precise for accidental movements. I noticed Mike's hands shaking each time it was his turn to ask the spirit a question. His cocky bravado had slipped away, revealing the uneasy boy beneath. But some dark fascination drove us onward, deeper into communication with this unearthly intelligence. The candle flames withered to glowing embers, casting our faces in shifting shadow. Our questions grew bolder, eliciting longer responses. Anna told sad stories of her life and described her lonely death at the age of 10, details no one could possibly have invented. Pangs of sympathy mingled with my unease as her tremulous replies spelled out a tale of woe. She claimed to have perished in these very walls, her body buried secretly beneath the cellar floor. Mike's eyes widened at that revelation, his face gone pale beneath his scruffy beard. The planchette circled the board rapidly, then shot to the upper corner, where the word goodbye indicated an end to communication. But though we said farewell, the spirit remained close. The flickering candles illuminated strange shadows that lingered at the edges of our vision. Mike suggested we stop for the night, but a reckless curiosity gripped the rest of us. Spurred on by nervous energy, we resolved to make contact again. As we lay our hands on the planchette, the air grew colder still. Our breath came out in wispy puffs as we posed questions with quavering voices. At first, Anna's responses seemed weaker, as though diluted by distance. But soon, her answers grew stronger, more insistent. While her early messages had been polite, even charming, now sinister undercurrents colored her words. Thin scratches marred the board's surface as the planchette jerked violently. When we asked the spirit to prove its power in our realm, the lone bare bulb flickered. Heavy boots thudded on the floor above us, impossible in the abandoned upper floors. Mike whimpered softly, tears shining in his eyes reflected by the dying candlelight. I too felt unbridled terror rising in my throat like bile, But Sarah urged us onward, demanding the spirit reveal its darkest secrets. The planchette circled rapidly, an invisible force propelling it so hard it scratched the board. It spelled out arcane messages in languages unknown to us, scribbling madly until we pulled our hands away. As we huddled together, the feeble light dying, the air was torn by a howl that could not possibly have come from mortal lungs. Dark shapes darted around the edges of the room. A noxious odor assaulted us, tendrils of acrid smoke coiling toward the ceiling. Shadows gathered in the corners like living things. Cruel laughter echoed, inhumanely deep and raspy. Gleaming eyes glinted from nooks and crannies, blinking out one by one as nameless things crept nearer. We begged and wept, pleading with Anna to leave us in peace if she had any vestige of humanity left. The presence only grew heavier and colder, weighed down by malevolence. Mike was the first to break. With a strangled cry, he leapt to his feet and bolted for the stairs. Sarah chased after him, leaving Susan and I alone, gripping each other in wordless horror. No more questions arose to our lips, only whimpers and sobs. We hid our faces as the shadows converged. A bang from the top of the steps jolted us to our senses. Mike had slammed the door, sealing himself and Sarah in the upper rooms. Susan and I fled behind it, thrown open by an invisible touch as foul as icy talons. The candles we left burning sputtered out as shrieks pursued us. We regrouped outside beneath the anemic moon, too distraught to speak. Guilt washed over me when I noticed Sarah and Mike were absent. We were torn between fleeing this cursed house and finding our missing friends. But the choice was made for us by a flicker of light in the attic window. Against our better judgment, Susan and I crept back toward that beacon. Somehow, an eldritch force drew us back through the door, up the creaky steps, toward the flickering glow. It was not the pure light of fire, but something unnatural that throbbed and oozed like the lidless eye of a demon. The attic door stood ajar, a draft howling eerily through the gap. We clung to each other, whimpering, sweating though our skin was chilled to the bone. On leaden legs, we staggered through that narrow opening. Inside was a scene from a madman's nightmare. The Ouija board lay in the center of the room, the planchette spinning madly around it, untouched by human hands. Mike and Sarah huddled in opposite corners, eyes crazed, clawing at the walls as though desperate to escape. Dark tendrils of smoke snaked around them. All around, candles burned with black flames, dripping wax that sizzled like acid. The insidious light illuminated a large symbol scrawled on the sloping ceiling in what looked horribly like blood. Strange characters marked the walls, clearly traced by clawed, inhuman fingers. The atmosphere was unbearably oppressive, like the air before a violent storm. Every shadow seemed to harbor waiting demons. Mike and Sarah were utterly possessed by frenzied terror, beyond the reach of our pleading voices. Hopelessly, we turned to flee this nightmarish attic. But escape was not to be. Though we wrenched with hysterical strength, the door would not budge. Mocking laughter filled the room as we battered helplessly against it. When we turned back, 1,000 eyes awaited us from the darkness. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. We huddled together, weeping and screaming for release from our nightmare prison. But no help came, only ominous chuckles and slithering shadows. Strange eons seemed to pass as we slipped in and out of madness. At some hour past midnight, we felt the oppressive atmosphere begin to dissipate. The chittering darkness retreated, leaving only flickering candle stubs in the attic. In the returning quiet, I heard only the sound of soft sobbing and Mike's faint whispers as he prayed for salvation. Gradually, we found the courage to approach the door again. It swung open easily this time, as if it had never been stuck at all. As we helped Mike and Sarah down the stairs, the first rays of dawn shone through grimy windows. The ordeal was over. Once out of that house, which seemed almost benign by day, we swore never to trifle again with forces beyond our comprehension. We burned the Ouija board in the woods, exorcising its darkness with fire. To this day, I avoid anything remotely occult, for fear of awakening what I faced that night. Years later, researching the history of Mike's old house, I found disturbing reports of past tragedies buried in the archives of the local paper. In the black and white photographs of the original structure, I saw echoes of what we had experienced. Anna, it turned out, was no mere figment of an overactive imagination. Her death notice told of a girl who passed away in 1883 after a short illness. Her grieving family concealed her body in the cellar to preserve her innocent spirit. But it seems her lonely ghost remained, seeking solace from any visitor reckless enough to open doors to the other side. As for the ominous symbols we found scrawled in the attic, occult experts I consulted identified them as ritual markings meant to summon demonic entities. All evidence points to prior dark ceremonies in that house, ensuring it was a conduit for hellish forces. We had unwittingly stirred up those ancient evil currents, with terrifying consequences. In the decades since, I've learned just how foolish we were to trifle with forces far beyond our control. Ouija boards and seances seem harmless fun, but they can unlock doors best left shut and forgotten. Whatever dwells on the other side is not to be trusted. It is a realm of deception and manipulation whose only aim is to prey on naive mortals. I post my cautionary tale online, hoping other curious teens don't fall into the same trap. But interest in the dark arts only seems to grow as each generation scoffs at the warnings of their elders. They play with magic, not comprehending the true risks. I can only pray they'll be spared the scars some of us bear from dancing with darkness and barely living to regret it. The Ouija board holds no real answers, only deception. Its riddles aim to lure the curious into danger. Those who look into its depths may see innocent faces looking back, but these masquerade diabolical forces ancient and cunning. Never forget that the darkness has its own cold intelligence, far outmatching our frail human reason. So I beg you to listen and learn from my folly. The Ouija spirits tell pretty lies, spin phantom tales to reel in their catch. We who tested those waters live to regret it. Minds and nerves shattered by forces beyond comprehension. Curiosity killed far more than the cat when we meddled with powers no mortal can safely wield. Some nights, in my dreams, I still hear cruel whispers and see gleaming eyes draw near. That house and all its ghosts haunt me, a reminder never to let my guard down again. Ancient evils watch from the shadows, waiting to seize on human pride or reckless whim. Like sharks, they circle, seeking whom they may devour. Do not imagine you will master their dark arts or thwart their clever snares. Many have tried before you and left no trace, save for the tortured echoes of their screams. Those who contacted me spoke wisely. Let the dead rest. Do not linger where demons dwell. Evil that ancient cannot be dispelled, only shunned by those who value their lives and sanity. So let my warning stand. The unknown is not to be trifled with or flippantly courted. There are doors between worlds that must remain closed, for good reason. We get but one short life under the sun. Don't forfeit it to destructive curiosity. Keep your feet on solid earth and let the restless dead keep their secrets. I posted my camping experience on Reddit, hoping to share my harrowing story with others who might have encountered something similar. Last summer, I embarked on a solo camping trip to a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. The serene beauty of the woods drew me in, but little did I know that I would soon be plunged into a nightmarish encounter with the supernatural. On the second night of my journey, an eerie mist descended upon my campsite, obscuring the moonlight. A shiver ran down my spine as I heard faint whispers in the distance, like the soft sighs of a ghostly choir. I glanced around nervously, peering into the oppressive fog that had enveloped my camp. The wispy tendrils of mist swirled around the trees, casting an ominous pall over the forest. I tried to shake off my unease and tend to the campfire, but I couldn't ignore the prickling sense of dread that had settled over me. The flames danced and crackled, throwing strange shadows across the trees. Their crooked branches seemed to twist into gnarled hands reaching out for me. The whispers grew louder, a discordant chorus of lamenting voices. Compelled by morbid curiosity, I ventured away from the fire's comforting light into the sea of shadows. I scrambled up a steep incline, branches clawing at my arms and legs as I pushed through the underbrush. The full moon peered out from behind the clouds, bathing the forest in its cold glow. As I wandered deeper into the woods, the trees themselves seemed to shift and contort in the darkness. Sinister shapes lurked between the trunks, always darting out of sight as I glanced their way. It was as if the forest had come alive with restless spirits that whispered and beckoned to me. I stumbled into a moonlit clearing, where I saw her. The ghostly figure of a young woman in tattered clothing, her eyes hollow and full of sorrow. She stood beneath an ancient, gnarled oak tree, its limbs creaking in the wind. Her mournful gaze locked onto mine, rooting me to the spot. The apparition's lips did not move, but her voice echoed inside my mind. "Please, kind stranger, lend me your ear. I have been lost in these woods for so long, my spirit unable to find rest," she whispered. Her chilling words pierced my heart, even as the rational part of my mind screamed that this couldn't be real. I tried to speak, to ask her name and how I could help, but an invisible force clutched my throat. The phantom drew closer, her tattered white dress billowing around her feet, which did not quite seem to touch the ground. Her hollow eyes bored into mine as she told me of her fate. She had strayed from the path many years ago, lured by the beauty of the towering firs and the serenity of a secluded glen. But when darkness fell, she became turned around and lost her way. Exhausted and frightened, she took refuge under a great oak, never to wake again. By the time her search party found her body, her spirit was trapped between worlds. "Please, you must help me move on from this haunted place," she implored, her chilling voice echoing inside my head. I tried to back away, to flee from this unearthly encounter, but my limbs refused to obey. It was as if her ghostly presence paralyzed me. As I stood transfixed, more spectral shapes emerged from the looming trees. Their hushed voices blended together in a mournful susurrus, echoing the forest's own creaks and groans. These were not benign woodland spirits, but tortured souls who spoke of lives cut short and dreams left unfulfilled by tragedy and violence. They told tales of settlers who starved when winter came early, of loggers crushed by falling pines, of travelers who fell prey to the cruelty of bandits. Each specter shared their story as they encircled me, their chilling voices joining in a lament. I stood helpless, my heart gripped by fear and pity for these lost souls. The ghostly congregation grew larger as the full moon traversed the night sky. More spirits emerged from the shadows, some bearing fresh wounds that still oozed in death. They spoke of poachers' bullets and drunk drivers' remorseless vehicles, which cared not what they struck down in the night. As the chilling tales and whispered laments swirled around me, I felt my sanity strained to its limits. I had ventured too far and stirred up forces beyond my understanding. Now they besieged me, their cold spectral forms drifting closer until I stood at the center of their ghostly gathering. The night dragged on, the moon dipping low over the restless woods. Exhaustion overtook me, but I did not dare to sleep. I pinched myself, praying this was merely an awful dream conjured up by my wandering mind. But the ghostly congregation remained chillingly real and perceptible. At long last, the first glimmer of dawn pierced the eastern sky. The mist dissipated, fading away like the lost souls it had obscured. As the shadows retreated, the specters grew transparent, their mournful whispers fading on the morning breeze. In the soft, hazy light, the ghosts relinquished their hold on me and began to drift away. Like mere smoke on the wind, they scattered among the trees and faded from sight. In the distance, I heard the trill of a songbird greeting the dawn. The first mundane sound I'd heard in hours. I scarcely dared to breathe, half expecting the spirits to re-emerge from the shadows. But as the sun rose over the tranquil forest, the paranormal gathering seemed like a half-remembered nightmare. Had it been real, or merely my overwrought imagination conjuring up phantoms in the dark? In the calm light of morning, the woods appeared utterly benign once more. Nonetheless, I fled that haunted glen, crashing heedless through the brush until I burst from the tree line and beheld my campsite. I collapsed by the extinguished fire, more exhausted than I'd been in my life. I packed my gear with shaking hands before fleeing down the trail, grateful to be alive. Once I returned to civilization, I poured out my chilling tale on the paranormal threads of Reddit. I knew others would dismiss it as fiction or the delusion of an overactive mind, but I knew what I had experienced in those haunted woods, where restless spirits still lurk. Though I long to return to those tranquil woods by daylight, I will never set foot there again once night falls. For the ghosts remain eternally bound to that forest, and I cannot face again the wrath and despair of those tragic, tortured souls. Their plaintive voices still echo in my mind when I close my eyes to sleep. Sometimes I imagine I see their spectral forms drifting at the edge of my sight, bound to haunt me now as the only living person who witnessed their gathering. I pray they will find release someday from their purgatory in those timeless woods. But for now, their suffering lingers, and I alone remember their mournful tales. My story spread far and wide across Reddit, shared in hushed whispers on forums dedicated to the unexplained. Some offered sympathy and speculated I had stumbled across a portal between worlds. Others accused me of fabricating a campfire tale to frighten and titillate. But I knew the truth that waited in those haunted woods. Late at night, when sleep evaded me, I would trace the comments online, taking comfort from those who believed me. My story drew out others who had experienced the paranormal in those same woods over the years. They too spoke of unearthly whispers and ghostly forms glimpsed among the trees at night. One grizzled hiker had spotted mysterious flickering lights deep in the old-growth forest, as though candlelit spirits wandered its depths. A wildlife photographer described shadowy shapes that darted behind ancient trunks when she peered through her long lens. None had gathered the courage to fully confront the anomalies, yet neither could they stay entirely away. Those woods, they concurred, were imbued with a subtle dread, an unease that pricked at the primal senses. Yet even as they feared what lurked beyond the trails, they were drawn to traverse them again. It seemed the forest had marked them, taken some unknowable hold upon their hearts, calling them back to wander its misty paths. I too felt that irresistible allure, itching to load my pack and lose myself again in that labyrinth of soaring firs and maples. By day, I longed to gaze once more upon the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, smell the musty fragrance of decaying leaves underfoot, and listen to the soothing chorus of birdsong high overhead. But I resisted, unwilling to spend another night trapped among the mournful dead. Their chilling tales of lives cut short had shown me how thin the veil was between the living and the lost. I had stumbled into their realm and glimpsed the suffering that kept them from moving on. One moonlit night, I dreamed the ghostly woman in the tattered dress came to me again. Her sad eyes implored me, her voice echoing from somewhere far away. She spoke of the agony of lingering so long between two worlds, unable to fully detach from the living earth. I tossed and turned, begging her to find peace and release. She only shook her head, translucent tears glistening down her pallid cheeks. "It is you who must help me move on," she whispered. "Return to the place you found me, and you will know what to do." As she faded, I cried out, promising to try, though I did not know how. I awoke drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding. Could I really help her spirit find rest? Perhaps she was damned to haunt those woods forever, unless someone living intervened. But venturing back there filled me with dread. Once again, I would be at the mercy of restless ghosts and the ancient darkness that cloaked their world. Nonetheless, her pained pleas haunted me over the coming weeks. I knew I had to make one last journey to the haunted forest. If I failed to act, the ghostly woman and others like her would remain trapped. And perhaps they would never stop calling to me, dragging me back to dwell among them. On the anniversary of my fateful trip, I returned to face my fears. A heavy mist obscured the dirt trail as I approached the woods, my pulse racing. But under the bright noon sun, the forest did not seem ominous. Birds twittered and squirrels chattered as I hiked deeper into the emerald maze. When I reached the glen where I had seen the ghostly woman, everything appeared tranquil. The great oak tree's branches swayed gently, leaves rustling. Motes of dust danced in the slanting sunlight. No spirits emerged to beckon me. No voices invaded my mind. Kneeling before the oak, I placed a bouquet of wildflowers tied with a crimson ribbon, a symbol of life to balance out the death I had encountered here. I poured out heartfelt prayers for the ghosts to find eternal rest, tears streaking my face. I promised to remember them and share their tales so they would not be forgotten. As I spoke, a warm breeze sprung up, swirling around me. It carried the faint echoes of whispers, but this time, grateful and relieved, rather than anguished or enraged. Above, the oak tree's limbs shifted and groaned. One low-hanging branch snapped off, crashing down mere inches from where I knelt. I stumbled back in alarm, gazing up at the tree. There, carved into the trunk, were two sets of initials within a crude heart. They had been hidden previously by the branch, but now were exposed. Those initials must have marked where the ghostly woman met her end, and perhaps the lover who had carved them. I knew then that I had succeeded in laying her spirit to rest. The woods around me seemed lighter, the very air sighing with a sense of closure. The ghosts had found peace at last, freed from their torment. I hiked back with a light heart, glimpsing deer, rabbits, and other living creatures. The forest now teemed with life, no longer overshadowed by the restless dead. That night, I truly rested for the first time since my ordeal. I returned to those woods from time to time, communing with nature and paying my respects to its spirit guardians. The ghosts are gone, but not forgotten. Their tales deserve remembrance, lessons for the living. We who still draw breath must appreciate this gift, for our time too shall pass. And we must tread lightly on ancient lands, knowing what still lingers in the shadows. The wild places hold memories we can scarcely imagine, connecting us to eras long past and those who walked before us. Their essence lingers, bound to the eternal land. So I share this story to exalt the mysteries of the forest, warn of the unknown, and remember those souls who have moved on. The veil between living and dead remains thin, parting at times to reveal what lies beyond. Not all who wander among the trees walk solely in this realm. We inhabit a land alive with invisible spirits, echoes of the past, and a constant whisper of the inevitable future when we too shall pass on. But for now we have under our feet the solid earth, over our heads the sun and stars. Let us revel in this moment we are granted and make it worthy of remembrance. I'd heard the stories about St. Michael's Asylum, the abandoned mental institution that loomed on the outskirts of town. They said it was a place where madness had festered, where patients had been subjected to unspeakable horrors. But when I found myself desperate for a job, the offer of a night shift security position at St. Michael's was one I couldn't refuse. As I pulled up to the decrepit building on my first night, I felt a sense of dread that clung to me like a shadow. The entrance to the asylum was a set of imposing double doors, covered in peeling paint and framed by cracked, stained glass. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere was thick with the musty scent of decay. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness, illuminated only by the feeble glow of my flashlight. Every step echoed like a whisper, and the ancient floorboards creaked beneath my feet. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. This was my first night on the job, and I was alone in this vast, labyrinthine structure. The stories of apparitions and strange occurrences had been relayed to me with ominous warnings by the few who had dared to enter these forsaken halls. I brushed aside my unease, attributing it to nerves, and continued my patrol. As the hours dragged on, a palpable sense of isolation enveloped me. The silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water, or the distant scuttling of unseen creatures. Each shadow seemed to hold secrets, each creak of the floorboards a hidden message. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes followed my every move. In the flickering light of my flashlight, I explored the asylum's decaying rooms. Peeling wallpaper and broken furniture bore witness to the passage of time, and the remnants of restraints and forgotten belongings hinted at the institution's grim past. The complex emotions I felt ranged from fascination to unease, as if the very walls were whispering their tragic tales. My exploration brought me to the asylum's basement, a place that had garnered a sinister reputation. The air grew colder, and the narrow passageways seemed to close in on me. My flashlight's beam danced over rusted pipes and crumbling walls, revealing graffiti left by daring trespassers and, inexplicably, the faint sound of distant laughter. Fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I knew I was supposed to remain vigilant, but the sense of dread was becoming overwhelming. It felt as though the asylum itself had come alive, its history of suffering and torment seeping into my very being. I couldn't help but question my decision to take this job. As I continued to explore, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the dimly lit corridors. I followed the sound to a room that had been used for shock therapy. Inside, an old leather restraint chair stood in stark contrast to the peeling floral wallpaper. The laughter seemed to emanate from the chair itself, chilling me to the bone. I hesitated, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. Curiosity battled with fear, and I knew I had a choice to make. Would I stay and confront the source of the eerie laughter, or would I retreat from this haunted place, never to return? With trembling hands, I approached the chair, my flashlight trembling in the darkness. And then, as I stood before it, the laughter ceased, replaced by an overwhelming silence that seemed to press down on me like a weight. The room felt colder than ever, and I knew that something beyond explanation had just occurred. As I left that room and made my way back to the entrance, the dread that had haunted me from the start lingered like a ghostly presence. I couldn't deny that St. Michael's Asylum held mysteries that defied explanation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my first night on the job was just the beginning of a journey into the unknown. As the weeks turned into months, I continued my night shifts at St. Michael EOS, determined to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. The strange occurrences became a nightly occurrence. Lights flickered and dimmed at their own whims, and cold drafts seemed to emanate from nowhere. One night, as I patrolled the upper floors, I heard the faint sound of a piano playing in the distance. It was a melancholic tune, its notes haunting and beautiful. The music seemed to draw me in, and I followed it through a maze of dimly lit hallways until I reached a room at the end of a corridor. The door to the room was ajar, and as I pushed it open, the music stopped abruptly. Inside, I found a grand piano covered in a dusty white sheet. It hadn't been played in years, yet the melody had sounded so vivid. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder who or what had been playing that haunting tune. As I continued my rounds, I began to notice other strange phenomena. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut with a violent force, and whispers echoed through the hallways, their words too faint to understand. The asylum seemed to come alive at night, and its malevolent presence was impossible to ignore. One particularly chilling night, I was making my way through the basement when I heard a child's laughter, sweet and innocent, echoing through the darkness. It was a stark contrast to the horrors that had taken place within these walls. I followed the sound to a small room tucked away in a corner, its door slightly ajar. As I entered the room, the laughter ceased, and I was met with an eerie stillness. The room was empty, save for a decaying crib in the corner. It was as if the laughter had come from a ghostly child, a presence that had long since departed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't help but feel that I was not alone in that room. As the months turned into a year, I became consumed by the mysteries of St. Michael's Asylum. I researched its history, trying to uncover the stories of the patients who had suffered within its walls. The more I learned, the more I realized that the horrors of this place ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. One night, as I delved deeper into my research, I stumbled upon a name that sent a chill down my spine: Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood, the asylum's former director. He had been a notorious figure in the field of psychiatry, known for his cruel and inhumane experiments on patients. It was said that he had conducted his most horrific experiments in the very basement of the asylum. I couldn't help but wonder if the malevolent presence that lingered in the building was somehow connected to Dr. Blackwood's dark legacy. Had his tormented soul become trapped within these walls, forever seeking retribution for the atrocities he had committed? One night, as I ventured into the basement once again, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was a silhouette of a man, and as I stared into those piercing eyes, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The figure raised a finger to its lips in a silent gesture, and I knew that it wanted me to be silent, to keep its presence a secret. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, as the figure faded back into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that I had encountered something truly malevolent, something that defied all reason. As the years went by, I continued my night shifts at St. Michael's Asylum, bearing witness to the unexplainable and the horrifying. The apparitions and strange occurrences persisted, and I couldn't help but feel that the asylum itself was a living, breathing entity, a repository of darkness and despair. I often wondered if I would ever uncover the truth behind the mysteries of St. Michael S., if I would ever find a way to free the tormented souls that lingered within its walls. But for now, I remained trapped in a never-ending nightmare, my nights filled with dread and astonishment, and my days haunted by the knowledge that the asylum held secrets that would forever remain hidden in the shadows. The forest was dense, a sprawling tapestry of ancient trees and tangled underbrush. Each step I took was deliberate, the crunch of fallen leaves and twigs beneath my boots echoing in the stillness. My mission was simple: gather firewood before nightfall. But as the sun's golden rays began to wane, casting elongated shadows that danced and flickered, an unsettling feeling settled in my chest. I had heard the tales, whispered around campfires, and passed down through generations. Stories of skinwalkers, elusive creatures that roamed the woods, shifting their forms and preying on unsuspecting souls. I had always dismissed them as mere folklore, tales to scare children. But today, the atmosphere was different, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The once familiar sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, were now replaced by an eerie silence. Only the rhythmic thud of my heartbeat filled my ears. Suddenly, a soft rustling broke the quietude. I froze, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the soft whisper of fabric against skin. I turned slowly, scanning the dimming woods, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking off the unease, I resumed my search, gathering twigs and branches. As I bent to pick up a particularly gnarled piece of wood, a chilling howl pierced the air. It was neither wolf nor coyote, but something far more sinister, a sound that seemed to resonate from another realm. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my brow. I clutched the firewood tightly, my eyes darting in every direction, and then I saw it. A figure, not quite human, not quite animal, stood at the edge of the clearing. Its eyes, a deep shade of amber, glinted with malevolence. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide what creature it wanted to be. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The skinwalker, for I had no doubt that's what it was, began to move toward me. Each step it took was deliberate, a predator stalking its prey. The world around me seemed to blur, my focus solely on the creature before me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I hurled a piece of firewood at it. The log passed right through the entity, as if it were made of smoke. The skinwalker let out a guttural laugh, a sound that chilled me to my core. Desperation fueled my legs, and I ran. Branches whipped at my face, and roots threatened to trip me. But I didn't dare slow down. The creature's haunting laughter echoed in my ears, spurring me on. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I burst into a clearing bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The skinwalker's presence faded, its malevolent energy no match for the sanctity of the light. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my camp. As I collapsed, exhausted and shaken, I realized the forest had forever changed for me. The tales were real, and I had come face to face with one of its darkest legends. That night, as I sat by the roaring fire, every crackle and pop made me jump. The woods were no longer just trees and animals. They were alive with mysteries and ancient beings. And though I had escaped the clutches of the skinwalker, its haunting visage would forever be etched in my memory. A grim reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the veil of reality. My name's Hank, and I've been a trucker going on 20 years now. I've spent more nights than I can count driving the back highways across this country. Just me and the long, open road ahead. When people ask me about my job, they think it's all just sitting alone, bored out of your mind. But there's a lot strange stuff that happens out there in the darkness, things you need to see to believe. Some nights still give me the chills thinking back on them. I've seen things from my cab I won't ever be able to explain. But the night I still have the hardest time getting out of my head was in the winter of '97 coming through Nebraska. The snow had been coming down heavy for hours, beating on the windshield steady like a drum. The roads were just black ice at that point, and traffic had all but disappeared. Most folks had taken shelter for the night, leaving me the only idiot still driving down that frozen highway. I had a delivery to make on time in Iowa, so the weather wasn't stopping me no matter how bad she got. White-knuckling the wheel, I squinted out into the sea of snow, not able to see but maybe 20 feet ahead. My radio had gone to static about 50 miles back, and the silence made me uneasy. Other than the roar of my engine, it was like the whole world around me had vanished. Even my headlights barely cut through the heavy snowfall as I crawled along at 15 miles per hour. I was just focused on staying on the road when, through the storm, I spotted someone walking alone down the shoulder. I tapped my brakes out of reflex, though there was no way I was stopping way out here for some crazy hitchhiker in this mess. At first, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks. As I got closer, I saw it was a young woman stumbling along. She was wearing nothing but a ripped-up nightgown, soaked through, no shoes, arms wrapped around herself, shivering. What the hell was she doing out in this blizzard all by herself, I wondered. Every sensible voice told me to keep going, just call emergency services once I got to a phone. But something about the way she looked made me pull over against my better judgment. I cut the engine and stepped down into 6 inches of fresh fallen snow, the flakes stinging like needles on my skin. At the sound of my door, she whipped around startled. Even through the storm, I could see she was terrified as she backed away from me like a cornered stray. I raised my hands and called out that I only wanted to help and get her somewhere warm, but she wouldn't make eye contact. Slowly, I convinced her to take my coat and come inside the cab to thaw out and explain what happened. In the cab, I got the heat blasting as she huddled shaking on the passenger seat. Still wary of me, she seemed in shock, barely mumbling one-word answers as I pressed her for any info. All she managed was that her name was Ellen, and that she needed to get far away from here. Now. The fear in her eyes convinced me not to push further. I figured she'd been through something awful, but right now she just needed warmth. I told her we'd go straight to the nearest police station once the storm passed. We drove on slow and quiet for maybe 20 more miles when suddenly I started to pick up something beyond the static on the radio. At first it sounded like voices under the white noise. I was stunned to hear a man talking calmly as if doing a report about escaping into the storm from some facility. The radio cut in and out until I made out the words, "Extremely dangerous psychiatric patient, escaped custody." My stomach dropped and I looked over at Ellen staring petrified at the radio. I tried to tune the signal but couldn't make out any more words before the static took over. "Was someone holding you somewhere against your will?" I asked. She went quiet, but her face said everything. I'd picked up an escaped mental patient. God only knew what she was capable of or what I had gotten myself into. The logical part of my brain said pull this rig over and get the hell away from her before things got worse. But looking at her shivering and terrified, I couldn't just abandon her if she was really running from some awful place that did her harm. My only choice was getting her to the police so they could sort out the facts and help her. I made her swear she wouldn't try anything crazy. and when she nodded, I decided we would ride out the storm together. The snow was letting up some by the time the interstate into Des Moines came into view. I was starting to let my guard down, thinking we were in the clear, when Ellen suddenly started shouting frantically for me to pull over. She sounded panicked, saying we were being followed, and they were coming to take her. I checked the mirrors, but the road behind us was desolate. To calm her, I assured her we were alone and would be at the station soon. But it wasn't 30 seconds later that a set of blinding headlights emerged from the inky darkness behind us, barreling up the highway at breakneck speed. Ellen began screaming and flailing, certain it was them, that they had somehow found and tracked her down. I still tried convincing myself she was just confused and it was merely some random passing car. But as the vehicle dangerously closed the gap, I noticed it was an ominous black van, tailgating us perilously close. My gut twisted into knots when suddenly their high beams flicked on, nearly blinding me through the mirrors. I struggled to see the road as my mind raced. Who the hell were these guys in the van, and how in God's name did they know our exact location? It was clear now there was no possible way I could safely pull over and let them take Ellen, not with her screeching and wailing hysterically that they had come to kill her. Considering the lengths they had gone to pursue us, I figured they likely had no problem killing us both. My only choice left was to lose them or die trying. I slammed the pedal flat to the floor and the semi's engine roared in protest as we surged forward. But the van easily kept pace, swerving wildly from side to side trying to overtake us. My lumbering rig was no handling match for the speed and maneuverability of that van on the snow-slicked road. I knew if I didn't manage to shake them quickly, we were both as good as dead. 2 more lost souls disappearing forever into the cold, dark oblivion of the Nebraska highway. My mind raced desperately, grasping for any possible way to escape from the relentless van shadowing us. They were determined not to let us get away. As if to prove the point, they suddenly rammed the rear corner of my trailer, nearly sending us into a deadly spin-out. It was then, through the panic, that I spotted a glowing exit sign ahead for a small, rural truck stop and service center, maybe half a mile farther down the road. In that instant, I realized it was likely our sole chance of getting out of this nightmare alive. I warned Ellen to brace herself as I sent us fishtailing recklessly towards that exit at over 75 miles per hour. The van stayed glued to our rear, clipping the back fender and struggling to maintain contact as we hurtled toward the glowing salvation of the rest stop. I didn't even consider slowing down until we finally jerked to a tire-screeching stop, taking cover under the lights and amongst the few parked trucks. Unable to brake in time, the black van roared past us, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I sat there panting, heartbeat throbbing in my ears as I anxiously peered out into the gloom, waiting for any sign of their headlights reappearing. Next to me, Ellen was bent forward, her face buried in her arms as she sobbed heavily, overwhelmed with relief that we had somehow escaped them. After endless, tense minutes with still no van returning, I slowly stepped outside on shaky legs, desperate now to summon help before they came back. I had absolutely no idea who these ruthless people after Ellen were, or why they wanted her so badly. But we had managed to evade them, at least for now. Getting her to police quickly and telling them everything was the only shred of hope either of us had left. This whole mess had gone far beyond just helping a stranger along some snowy highway. That terrifying encounter was genuinely the very first time in my life I truly realized that some people in this world are capable of astonishing cruelty and evil. Ellen ended up in protective custody once the authorities were involved. She likely saved my own life that night. The police informed me those vicious men in the van almost certainly would have killed me in cold blood once they finished with her. Still gives me chills remembering that black van bearing down on us out of the darkness, absolutely relentless. Sometimes being a decent Samaritan and stopping to help can lead you down an unexpectedly dark road you never bargained for. Because out here alone on these endless highways, winding through the shadows each night, you honestly never know where the road ahead might ultimately take you, or what might be coming up fast to meet you on your journey. Late at night, as a nurse working the graveyard shift, I settled into the dimly lit hospital ward, where the hushed whispers of machines and the distant hum of life support systems created an eerie symphony. The comatose patient in room 217, Mr. Thompson, lay motionless, his frail body clinging to the last threads of life. It was a routine night until the moment the old rotary phone on my desk began to ring. Startled, I answered, but all I heard was a guttural, raspy breath on the other end. "Room 217, the voice whispered before disconnecting. Shivers raced down my spine as I glanced at Mr. Thompson's room. What could this be? Trembling, I dialed the room number and listened. There was no sound, no movement. Just the machines, steady and unchanging. Minutes later, the phone rang again. Its ringtone like a death knell. "Room 217, the voice repeated, more urgent this time. I rushed to the room, my heart pounding. As I entered, the monitors displayed normal readings, but Mr. Thompson's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. His lips moved, but no sound escaped them. The room was freezing, and I could see my breath in the air. I knew something was terribly wrong. I called the doctor, my voice trembling as I described the bizarre events. As I hung up, the phone in the room rang, startling me. It was the same guttural voice, now desperate, repeating, "Help me, help me." Tears welled in my eyes as I tried to comfort Mr. Thompson, but he couldn't communicate. The doctor arrived, confusion etched across their face as they examined the patient and the monitors that inexplicably displayed signs of life. We stood there, helpless, as the phone continued to ring, the voice growing more agonized with each call. Despite our efforts, we couldn't decipher the source of these calls or the torment plaguing the room. Hours passed, and with each call, the voice grew weaker until finally, it faded into silence. Mr. Thompson's monitors flatlined, and he peacefully slipped away. The room was still, and the phone sat motionless on my desk. I couldn't explain what had transpired that night, and I doubted I ever would. All I knew was that something beyond the realm of science had visited room 217, and it left me with a chilling certainty that some mysteries were best left unsolved. The air was thick with a silence so profound it seemed almost tangible. The moon, a mere sliver, hid behind a veil of clouds, casting shadows that seemed to dance and whisper secrets of the unseen. I was alone, the solitude of the house a constant, echoing reminder of my isolation. The tales of the Wendigo, a creature of legend and nightmare, had been whispered through the generations. A harbinger of death, it was said to roam the dense woods, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. I had always dismissed these tales as mere folklore, stories meant to instill fear and obedience in children. But that night, the shadows seemed to hold a sinister intent, and the air was charged with an unseen menace. A sudden rustle outside broke the oppressive silence. I strained my ears, my breath held, my heart pounding in my chest. I cautiously approached the window, peering into the darkness. My blood ran cold as I saw a figure, tall and emaciated, standing at the edge of the woods. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural crimson red, were fixed on me, and a chill of pure terror gripped my soul. The creature was a skeletal figure, its pale, leathery skin stretched tight over protruding bones. It moved with a predatory grace, its steps utterly silent, its penetrating gaze never leaving mine. Its claws, long, jagged, and yellow, were stained with a dark, viscous substance that looked nauseatingly like old blood, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp, yellowed teeth. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The legend spoke of the Wendigo's ability to mimic human voices, to lure its prey into its deadly embrace. I listened intently, every fiber of my being on high alert, waiting for any sound, any indication of its presence. The silence was deafening, the tension palpable. I barricaded myself in my room, pushing heavy furniture against the door with trembling, sweat-slicked hands. The air was stifling, the presence of the creature a tangible weight on my chest. I clutched a makeshift weapon, a heavy flashlight, in my white-knuckled grip. my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The hours dragged on at an agonizing pace, the tension in the air almost unbearable. The Wendigo remained outside, its silhouette a constant, menacing presence. I could see its shadow through the curtains, tall and misshapen, motionless. It seemed to be toying with me, savoring my fear, feeding off my escalating terror. I could hear its raspy, wet breaths, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would strike. As the first rays of the sun pierced the horizon, the creature let out a scream so chilling it seemed to freeze my very soul. It was an anguished, inhuman wail that reverberated through my mind. The Wendigo retreated into the shadows, its twisted form melting into the darkness. I remained frozen, my body numb, my mind a whirlwind of fear and tentative relief. The Wendigo had gone with the dawn, but its presence lingered, a dark shadow over my soul. The legends were true, and I had come face to face with the embodiment of consummate evil. The experience had left me scarred, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the unseen, waiting to consume the unwary. I now live in constant fear, the memories of that night haunting my every waking moment. The Wendigo is out there, a specter in the night, and I know it will return. Its seething hunger unquenched, its malevolence undiminished. And I will be waiting, a lone sentinel in the darkness, ready to face the nightmare once more. The hospital had always been a place of healing, or so we thought. Beneath its sterile surface, beneath the veneer of compassion, there lurked a malevolent presence, ready to shatter the illusion of safety and care. It began with hushed whispers among the staff, a series of unexplained disappearances that sent shivers down our spines. Colleagues we had worked alongside for years had vanished without a trace, their faces haunting our memories like fading ghosts. Rumors of a serial killer stalking the hospital staff had spread like wildfire. Authorities were called in, and security was heightened, but the disappearances continued unabated. Fear had become a palpable presence in the once bustling hospital corridors, casting long shadows over our daily routines and making the very air we breathed feel tainted. I was a nurse on the night shift, and it was during one of those long, eerie nights that I found myself drawn to the forgotten sub-basement. It was a place that had been abandoned for decades, a labyrinthine maze of decaying walls and forgotten equipment. The very air seemed to carry the weight of countless forgotten souls, their whispers echoing in the darkness. It was the perfect hiding place for someone who didn't want to be found. As I ventured deeper into the subterranean darkness, the dim emergency lights flickered ominously overhead, casting eerie, elongated shadows that seemed to dance to a sinister tune. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of my own footsteps echoed through the desolate corridors, a symphony of solitude and dread that reverberated in the marrow of my bones. My heart raced, and every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking menace, but I couldn't stop myself. I was driven by an unshakable curiosity and a gnawing fear that I might be the next victim. The walls around me bore witness to the hospital's forgotten history, their cracked surfaces bearing cryptic messages from a time long past. The paint was peeling, and the oppressive scent of decay clung to every surface, suffocating me. It was in the darkest corner of that forsaken place that I found the first message. It was scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood, its crimson hue vivid against the peeling wallpaper. The words were chilling in their simplicity. "You're next." A wave of terror washed over me as I stumbled back, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who had written this? How had they known I would come here? Was it a cruel prank? Or was the killer toying with me, luring me deeper into their macabre game, a game I had unwittingly joined? I fled the sub-basement, my heart pounding, and made my way to the authorities. They launched an immediate investigation, but the message had vanished when they arrived, leaving no trace of its ominous presence. I was met with skepticism and concern for my well-being, but deep down, I knew that I had uncovered something deeply sinister, a malevolent force that had taken root within the hospital's very foundations, a force that seemed to thrive on fear and chaos. Over the following weeks, the hospital staff lived in a state of perpetual fear. We were all potential targets, and the feeling of being constantly watched hung over us like a suffocating fog. The disappearances continued, each one shrouded in mystery and dread, as if the hospital itself had become a breeding ground for the macabre. As the hospital's once bustling hallways grew quieter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of fabric sent a chill down my spine. The killer was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, waiting for me to let my guard down. The forgotten sub-basement had become a place of dread, its walls bearing sinister messages that seemed to multiply with each passing day. "You can't hide. Your time is coming," they taunted, their sinister presence palpable. The killer's malevolence had seeped into the very core of the hospital, a darkness that defied explanation, a darkness that was becoming impossible to escape. And as the list of missing hospital staff continued to grow, I couldn't help but wonder, would I be the next to vanish into the abyss, leaving only a cryptic message scrawled in blood on the walls of the forgotten sub-basement as a haunting reminder of my fate? The malevolent presence that had infiltrated our sanctuary of healing seemed relentless, its grip on our lives tightening with each passing day, as if it derived sustenance from our fear and desperation. Weeks had passed since the discovery of that chilling message in the sub-basement, but the hospital's corridors still echoed with fear and uncertainty. The disappearances continued unabated, each one adding to the ever-growing sense of dread that seemed to permeate the very walls of the building. We were all prisoners trapped in a sinister game where the rules remained unknown. As a nurse on the night shift, I found myself constantly on edge, my senses heightened to every sound and shadow. The hospital had become a place of dread, its once familiar hallways now twisting into mazes of terror. The killer, it seemed, could strike at any moment, and there was no solace to be found, not even in the sanctuary of our own thoughts. One particularly frigid night, as I made my rounds, I noticed something unusual, a faint whisper that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination, a manifestation of my growing paranoia. But as I drew closer to the source, I realized that the whisper was real, distinct, and filled with a chilling urgency. The voice was soft, almost ethereal, as if it belonged to someone on the precipice of existence. "Help me," it pleaded, its words carrying a weight of suffering that sent a shiver down my spine. I followed the voice, my heart pounding, until I found myself standing in front of a long-forgotten storage room. The room's door creaked open with a haunting lament, revealing a space filled with dusty, forgotten equipment. But what drew my attention was the message scrawled on the wall in a crimson hue that could only be blood. "They took me." I felt a mixture of dread and curiosity as I scanned the message. Was it the work of the serial killer? Had they hidden a victim here, hoping that someone would discover their plight? The voice continued to whisper, guiding me further into the room, and I soon found myself standing before an old, rusted cabinet. With trembling hands, I opened the cabinet to reveal a scene that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Inside lay a human hand, severed at the wrist, its pallid fingers outstretched in a silent plea for help. The sight was enough to send bile rising in my throat, and I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I knew I had to contact the authorities immediately. This was no longer a matter of rumor or suspicion. It was a gruesome reality that demanded swift action. As I rushed to make the call, the voice in the room grew louder, its anguish echoing through the corridors. The authorities arrived in a flurry of activity, their faces grim as they assessed the gruesome discovery. It was clear that the hospital had become the hunting ground for a sadistic killer, one who reveled in tormenting both the living and the dead. The hand was carefully collected as evidence, and the investigation intensified. In the days that followed, the hospital staff faced a renewed sense of terror. We had been confronted with the macabre evidence of the killer's deeds, a stark reminder that no one was safe. Security measures were increased once more, But it seemed that the malevolent presence that had infiltrated our sanctuary was always one step ahead. The voice in the storage room continued to whisper, its words growing more frantic with each passing night. It was as if the hospital itself had become a sentient entity, its walls bearing witness to unspeakable horrors. And though the investigation pressed on, the killer remained elusive, leaving behind only cryptic messages and a trail of terror. As I returned to my duties, the knowledge that the killer was still at large weighed heavily on my mind. The hospital had become a place of unspeakable horror, a battleground where the forces of good and evil clashed in a relentless struggle. The malevolent presence that had taken root within its walls showed no signs of relenting, and the abyss seemed to beckon, its depths unfathomable and filled with dread. The nightmare continued, and with each passing day, the line between the living and the dead blurred further. We were all prisoners in this sinister game, and the question that haunted my every thought was whether I would be the next to face the abyss, leaving behind only a cryptic message scrawled in blood as a haunting testament to the darkness that had consumed our hospital. An icy gale screamed through the Crescent Bay dockyards, setting the maze of cranes and shipping containers rattling as if crying out in pain. In his small shack, overlooking the piers, Richard shivered as he prepared for his night shift, the lone fluorescent bulb flickering erratically to cast uneven shadows. He pulled his frayed coat tighter, the bitter chill already seeping into his bones as he poured a cup of coffee with unsteady hands. Outside, the ocean swelled and crashed against the docks, the icy spray mingling with ribbons of fog that obscured the labyrinthine yard. Settling into his creaking chair, Richard tried to focus on paperwork, ignoring the groaning of metal and the slap of waves. As midnight approached, an uneasy feeling needled him, the repetitive tasks doing little to distract his wandering mind. The fluorescent bulb pulsed and dimmed, cloaking the office in moving shadows that played tricks on Richard's fatigued eyes. He glanced warily through the window, unable to see more than a few feet through the thick haze. Around 1 a.m., Richard first noticed the sound, faint murmurs and whispers swirling within the silver mist. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as the voices floated up from the direction of Dock 13. Richard's pulse quickened at the thought of that remote pier and its haunted tales, which he had always dismissed before. He paused, listening intently as the whispers sharpened into clearly distinct, if bodiless, speech. Curiosity slowly overtook apprehension as the voices beckoned from beyond the veil of fog. Richard's hands shook as he grabbed his flashlight, its beam barely penetrating the soup-like shroud. The biting chill intensified with each step as he picked his way haltingly through the metal labyrinth toward that mysterious pier. Even the coffee in his veins could not stop the shivering that now racked his body. Reaching Dock 13, Richard hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swept the flashlight's weak beam across the shadowy containers and dripping ropes, the mournful voices rising around him. The icy film of fog seemed to swirl and congeal into vague human shapes, their ragged outlines materializing from the mist. Richard stood paralyzed as the phantoms shuffled forward, their ghostly forms illuminating the darkness. Their faces were sunken and pallid, glowing with an unearthly sheen. The tattered uniforms they wore hung from their skeletal frames, stained with dark splotches that looked horribly like old blood. The phantom nearest to Richard turned its hollow eyes upon him, sending a spike of primal terror through his heart. The ghost's facial features were gaunt and elongated, its skin stretched taut over the bones. Behind its cracked, pale lips, Richard glimpsed the hint of tombstone teeth. Its bony hands reached out to him, long fingers curving like ghastly claws. The ghost's mournful cry fused with the howling wind, its distorted voice echoing from some unfathomable depth. Richard stumbled back, his own cry of fear lodged in his throat. More ragged specters crowded behind the first, their glow casting flickering shadows over the empty containers. As the ghosts shambled toward him, Richard finally found his voice again, a strangled yell of pure horror tearing from his lips. His trembling hands lost their grip on the flashlight, sending it clattering to the dock below. He whipped around in blind panic, fleeing the scene as the phantom's cries pursued him. Richard ran until his legs burned and his lungs screamed for air. Only once safely back in the office did he collapse, his heart threatening to pound through his chest. He knew none would believe his tale, but vowed never to work the night shift alone again, nor venture near the haunted Dock 13. Though few believed him, the legend spread, ensuring the site's infamy.